It was the Lannisters who had failed to grasp the shifting tides of power, the winds that were beginning to blow from the sands of Dorne. For now, she kept her thoughts to herself, offering only a faint, fleeting smile. This, after all, was not the time for public confrontation. Chapter 55, Cersei 4. Chapter text. Cersei 4. The Martells had been in the capital for 2 days, and Cersei was making every effort to seize each moment with her daughter, despite the chasm of time and distance that had stretched between them. Each moment felt heavy, laden with unspoken questions and the tension of their fractured relationship. As she stood beside Myrcella, Cersei couldn't help but feel as though she were meeting a stranger. The girl she had once known was no longer there, replaced by a young woman whose presence was a stark reminder of how much had changed, not just in her life, but in Cersei's as well. Myrcella had barely been 11 when she left for Dorne, still a child in so many ways. But now, standing before Cersei at the age of 18, Myrcella was the picture of maturity and grace. She held herself with the poise of a true princess, her posture straight, her demeanor calm, yet there was a warmth in her eyes that Cersei found both comforting and strange. She looked so much like Cersei had at her age, beautiful, poised, and confident, but with a richer complexion, the golden sun of dawn having kissed her skin and deepened it to a warm olive tone. Myrcella was a product of both Cersei's blood and the sun-drenched lands that had shaped her. As they sat together in the quiet corner of the royal gardens, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air, Myrcella spoke of Dorne, her voice soft but filled with genuine affection. Sunspear feels like home now, she said, a faraway look in her eyes as if she were transported to the warm, fragrant streets of her adopted city. It's a place of light and heat, so different from King's Landing. Her gaze flickered briefly to the towering walls of the Red Keep in the distance, but she didn't seem to linger on the thought. Dorne, it seemed, had fully claimed her as its own. She told Cersei how Tristan, ever attentive, always made her feel cherished. Every year, on my birthday, Tristan organizes a ball in my honor, Myrcella continued, a soft smile curling on her lips. He always gifts me something beautiful, a necklace with gems from Urinwood, a ring forged at Starfall. Something that reminds me of the place I now call home. During the hottest months of the year, we travel to the water gardens, Myrcella added, her voice filled with a sense of reverence for the beauty of Dorne. It's so peaceful there. We spend days bathing in the cool, clear water, resting beneath the shade of the great palm trees. It's the closest thing to paradise I've ever known. Myrcella's eyes softened as she spoke of the tranquil escape, and Cersei could almost picture it, her daughter, so serene, a part of something greater than she ever could have imagined. And yet, beneath the surface of these idyllic memories, there was something darker, something that hinted at the hardships Myrcella had endured. She hesitated, her voice faltering for a moment before she continued. Elia's birth was difficult, she admitted, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table where they sat. I struggled more than I expected. Tristan had to stay by my side, and when Elia finally came, I screamed for my mother, for you. The words felt like a quiet confession, a fragile moment where the veneer of royal composure slipped just slightly to reveal the vulnerability beneath. Cersei's heart twisted at the words. For a brief, sharp instant, she imagined what it would have been like to be there, to comfort Myrcella, to hold her hand through the pain. But that thought was quickly replaced by another, the harsh reality that Myrcella had grown up without her. In Dorne, she had become a mother in her own right, creating new memories, living a new life. And Cersei, no matter how hard she tried, had not been a part of it. There was a heavy silence between them, as Cersei processed the weight of her daughter's words. She could see the woman Myrcella had become, the strength and determination in her eyes, and for a moment, Cersei felt an unfamiliar sense of pride. And yet, beneath it all, a deep sorrow remained. Myrcella had grown into someone she barely recognized, someone Cersei could never have fully known. Elia is beautiful, Cersei said, her voice thick with emotion, trying to steady herself. You are both so strong. The words came out more broken than she had intended, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything more. She reached for Myrcella's hand, gripping it gently, though it felt unfamiliar and strange in her grasp. Myrcella's eyes softened in return, her gaze warm but tinged with something Cersei couldn't quite place. Thank you, mother, she said, the words not quite as natural as they should have been, but still genuine enough. The garden around them seemed to quiet as the moments stretched on, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Cersei longed to reach across that distance, to reclaim some part of the bond they once shared, but she wasn't sure if she knew how. Instead, she found herself staring at her daughter, the woman before her, and felt the overwhelming complexity of everything they had lost, and perhaps, what they could never regain. Father, Cersei called, her voice calm but insistent as she stood in the middle of her father's study, the faint rustling of papers the only sound in the quiet room. The heavy oak door creaked behind her as she shifted her gaze, her sharp eyes scanning the tables scattered with maps and letters. The study was always an impressive sight, filled with the scent of old leather and ink, the walls lined with bookshelves crammed full of knowledge and strategy, the very tools Tywin Lannister used to rule with his iron grip. But today, the room felt strangely unwelcoming, filled with a tension she couldn't quite place. Cersei's eyes skimmed over the papers laid out before her, maps of the north, and various battle plans scribbled in Tywin's precise handwriting. She knew they would be leaving for the north soon to deal with Stannis Baratheon and his forces. They had to finish this, to crush the Baratheon threat once and for all. But something about the situation felt off. The preparations had been delayed, and Cersei had no idea why. There was no word from the north or the Lannister forces, only more plans and contingencies. As she scanned the papers before her, a few caught her attention. Letters from House Valerian on Driftmark were strewn across the table, their wax seals still intact. The Valerius had been loyal to House Targaryen for centuries, and though they had shifted allegiances since Robert's rebellion, they remained an influential family. But what was their interest in the conflict with Stannis? And then, there were the maps of Dragonstone. Cersei's brow furrowed. Why were there so many detailed plans for Dragonstone, Stannis' stronghold, a place he had once loathed? She thought she knew all the strategies that had been devised for this campaign, and yet, these maps indicated a different direction. Was Stannis planning to return to Dragonstone? The very thought seemed odd. He had forsaken the island for years in his pursuit of the throne, after all. Why would he go back now? Her questions remained unanswered, and the sense of unease in the pit of her stomach grew stronger with each passing second. Cersei stood for a moment longer, her fingers brushing over the edges of the maps as if seeking some clarity that seemed just beyond reach. But it wasn't until she heard the soft click of the door that she finally turned her attention away from the papers. The doors to the study creaked open, and Tywin Lannister strode in, his commanding presence filling the room. Behind him was Jaime, his face a mask of calm indifference, though his eyes flicked to Cersei for a brief moment. Tywin didn't even acknowledge her presence, not in the way that would have been expected from a father to his daughter, but instead, he turned directly to the table, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Make yourself at home, daughter," Tywin said in his usual cool tone, but there was an underlying sharpness to his words. His gaze flicked briefly over the papers, noting their disarray as if it were an offense, and then returned to Cersei with a look of mild reprimand. His sharp eyes were always calculating, and in that moment, she could feel the weight of his disapproval. It was as though he had already deduced what she had done, he had seen through her. Cersei squared her shoulders, her chin lifting imperceptibly as she met her father's piercing gaze. She would not let him intimidate her, not when the stakes were so personal. "I was simply looking over the plans," she said smoothly, her voice carefully devoid of irritation. "I came to speak with you about something. I want to go to Dorne when Myrcella and her party leave. Just for a few months." Tywin's expression barely shifted, but the slight narrowing of his eyes spoke volumes. "You won't be going anywhere," he said, his tone clipped and authoritative, brooking no argument. "Not while we're preparing for the north." Cersei's lips tightened, but before she could interject, he continued, his voice cold and measured as though explaining strategy to a child. "Margaery is about to enter her confinement, and Tommen will need his mother more than ever. The city will need you. Should there be unrest, or worse, an attack, you must be here to command loyalty and ensure the stability of the throne." "That's why he has the King's Guard," Cersei countered, her voice sharp with frustration. "And his council. Tommen is the king. He does not need me to hold his hand through every decision." Tywin's jaw tightened, and his gaze grew more severe. "You misunderstand your role, Cersei. Tommen's strength as a king lies in the perception of unity, of stability within his family. Your absence would be noted, and tongues would wag. The king's mother abandoning the capital for a sojourn in Dorne would give the impression of disinterest, or worse, discord within the crown. I would hardly call it a sojourn, she snapped, unable to keep the edge from her tone. Myrcella is my daughter. I haven't been part of her life for years. Her marriage, her child, all of it happened without me. I only want. You want, Tywin interrupted, his voice like a whip crack. You want. Always what you want. Have you forgotten your duty, Cersei? Myrcella has made her life in Dorne, a life you secured for her through marriage. Your wants do not outweigh the needs of the realm. Cersei's nails dug into her palms, and for a moment, she struggled to keep her composure. She screamed for me, she said finally, her voice quieter, laced with a rawness she could not hide. When she was in labor, she screamed for her mother. And I wasn't there. That is the nature of parenthood, especially with daughters, Tywin said, his voice cold and pragmatic. Did you imagine you could keep her at your side forever? Clinging to your skirts like some simpering babe. She is my child, Cersei said, the words escaping her lips with venom, her eyes blazing with defiance. Do you expect me to let her slip away completely? To watch her live her life as a stranger to me? Tywin took a deliberate step closer, his imposing presence pressing down on Cersei, though she refused to back away. Your life ceased being your own the moment you stood before the Septon and pledged yourself to Robert Baratheon, he said, his voice low and razor-sharp. You were a queen, and now you are the king's mother. Soon enough, you will be the king's grandmother. Every moment, every action, every breath you take belongs to the crown. To the legacy of House Lannister. You are a piece on the board, Cersei, not the one moving it. The words landed with a palpable weight, and for a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick as honey. Jaime, leaning against the doorframe, straightened. His usual air of indifference was replaced with unease as he watched the clash of wills between father and daughter. He rarely stepped into their battles, experience had taught him it was futile, but today, he hesitated. His gaze lingered on Cersei, a flicker of concern in his green eyes. Father, Jaime began, his tone unusually careful. Perhaps. Tywin silenced Jaime with a single, withering glance that carried all the weight of his authority. Then, turning his attention back to Cersei, he fixed her with an inscrutable stare, as though evaluating her worth. After a moment, he abruptly turned away, his dismissal as cutting as the edge of a blade. If that's all, Cersei, he said coolly over his shoulder, I have real matters to attend to. Matters that actually shape the future of this house. Such as? Jaime interjected, his tone probing but cautious. Tywin straightened, his movements precise, like a general preparing for battle. Robb Stark has replied to my letter, he said. He claims that his father and brother are innocent of any treason. That neither they nor House Stark support Stannis Baratheon's claim to the Iron Throne. So they'll join us? Jaime asked, his brow furrowing. Tywin's glare darkened, as though frustrated by the naivety of the question. Lord Stark would have us believe that his father and brother are at the wall to defend the realm against another threat entirely, White Walkers. Cersei couldn't suppress her laughter, sharp and incredulous. White Walkers, she said, her tone dripping with mockery. And are the Snooks and Grumpkins marching south as well? Have the giants risen from their caves to join the fight? Tywin's expression remained as immovable as stone. Robb Stark claims this threat is real and that neither he nor his allies will swear any allegiance until it is dealt with. He suggests we consider joining them, or risk the realm being overrun. The same proposal, he says, has been extended to Stannis. Cersei's derisive scoff cut through the room. Surely, we're not foolish enough to entertain such nonsense, she said sharply. It's a trap. Anyone with half a wit could see that. A trap for what? Jaime asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Who knows? Cersei snapped, throwing up her hands. Get us all in the same room as Stannis and wipe us all off the map. Or perhaps the boy fancies himself a king now. No, Tywin said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. Robb Stark may be many things, a green boy leading armies, sentimental like his father, but he has no interest in the Iron Throne, no more than Ned Stark ever did. Then why? Cersei demanded, her frustration bubbling over. Why are we wasting time on this charade? Her eyes darted to the maps spread across the table. Driftmark, Dragonstone, the north. What's really happening, father? Why the delay? Tywin's sharp gaze settled on her, his jaw tightening. For a moment, the room was heavy with tension, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Finally, he spoke, each word deliberate. We are not delaying. We are preparing, he said. Robb Stark's claims of White Walkers may be folly, but his movements are not. He has mobilized his forces and is drawing them northward. Stannis Baratheon remains at the wall, consolidating his position. There is something happening in the north, something that goes beyond the usual squabbles of lords and crowns. I do not yet know what it is, but I will not march blindly into chaos. Cersei narrowed her eyes, stepping closer to the table to study the maps. Driftmark, Dragonstone, she muttered. You think Stannis plans to move south again? Tywin's silence was answer enough. Jaime crossed his arms, glancing between them. Then why the interest in Driftmark? Stannis doesn't hold it. Daenerys Targaryen has set sail from Meereen, Tywin announced, his voice as impassive as ever, though the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Cersei froze. There had always been whispers about the exiled Targaryen princess, but Cersei had dismissed them as the stuff of legends, tales of a silver-haired girl who walked unburned from fire, commanded an army of Unsullied and Dothraki savages, and raised 3 dragons to adolescence. They sounded more like bedtime stories meant to scare unruly children into submission than genuine threats to the Iron Throne. What? She managed, lowering her goblet. You can't be serious. The Dragon Princess, her voice dripped with derision, is finally leaving her dusty little city to what? Conquer Westeros. With what army? With what fleet? Tywin regarded her coolly, his expression a mask of measured patience, though there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Dragonstone has been abandoned since Stannis fled 5 years ago, he said, his tone clipped. The most logical destination is there. Dragonstone. Jaime leaned against the wall, arms crossed. That's bold. She has no foothold in Westeros. No allies. She doesn't need a safe foothold, Tywin replied, his tone sharp and unyielding. She needs a symbol, something that invokes the power and legitimacy of her claim. Dragonstone is not merely a castle, it is a monument to her family's legacy. It was the seat of her ancestors when they first set foot in Westeros, the place where the Targaryen conquest began. By landing there, she makes a statement to the entire realm. She is not some foreign upstart, but the true heir returning to reclaim what she believes is hers by blood and right. Cersei scowled, her fingers tightening around her goblet. And you think the lords of Westeros will flock to her because of a symbol? They are fools if they do. Fools or not, Tywin countered, his voice colder than the winter winds they were preparing to face in the north. Symbols matter. They rally men, inspire loyalty, and sow doubt in the hearts of our allies. If she secures Dragonstone, she has a base to solidify her position. And if she's as cunning as I suspect, she will already be turning people against us. Jaime, who had been pacing near the window, stopped and turned toward their father. You think that's why Robb Stark sent his letter, he said, his voice carrying a note of realization. You think the Starks have declared for her? Cersei laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. The Starks, bending the knee to a Targaryen. That would be rich. They've hated her family for generations. They lost half their house because of the Mad King's madness. Tywin's expression darkened, silencing her mirth. Do not underestimate desperation, Cersei. The Stark boy knows his position is weak. If Stannis Baratheon falters and Daenerys takes Dragonstone, Robb may see her as the only viable means of securing the North's future. He doesn't need to love the Targaryens, only to see the opportunity in aligning with her. Jaime frowned, his brow furrowing. But his letter didn't mention her. It was all about these White Walkers and refusing allegiance until the threat is dealt with. Couldn't that be genuine? Tywin fixed his son with a withering glare. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's a calculated delay. He knows Daenerys is coming and doesn't want to commit to a losing side too soon. If the Starks haven't already declared for her, they are certainly hedging their bets. If they unite with her, or even remain neutral long enough for her to gain momentum, we will have a war on multiple fronts. Cersei shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. So what do you propose, father? We sit and wait for this Dragon Queen to land, for Robb Stark to make his move. Are we to act as pawns in everyone else's game while they scheme behind our backs? Tywin's gaze shifted to her, sharp and cutting. No. We will act decisively, as we always do. The first step is ensuring that Daenerys Targaryen finds no allies here. The houses of the Stormlands, the Riverlands, and the Reach must remain firmly in Tommen's camp. And we need to deal with Stannis and the Northerns quickly. And what of her dragons? Cersei asked, her voice laced with skepticism. If they even exist, how do we fight those? Tywin's expression remained unmoved, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. Dragons are not invincible. They can be killed, just as they were in the past. But that will require strategy and preparation. If she brings them to Westeros, she will learn that fire and blood alone are not enough to win a war. Cersei's lips pressed into a thin line. She hated how calm Tywin was in the face of such an unprecedented threat. Yet his words carried the same terrifying certainty they always did, a certainty that left no room for doubt or defiance. Still, a nagging thought lingered at the back of her mind. For all Tywin's careful planning, this Targaryen girl seemed to have the kind of luck, or madness, that defied even the most calculated strategies. So, we go north? Jaime asked, leaning forward, his tone somewhere between eagerness and resignation. Yes, Tywin replied crisply. We go north, and we deal with Stannis Baratheon once and for all. The Tyrell army has already arrived in the city, and with the Valyrian fleet under our command, we can transport the bulk of our forces north swiftly and discreetly. Cersei frowned, her skepticism plain on her face. The fleet? You intend to sail? Yes, Tywin said, his tone brooking no argument. We set sail at dawn. Our destination is Eastwatch by the sea. From there, we will march westward to Castle Black. The journey by foot will be arduous, but by the time we make landfall, it will be too late for Robb Stark to send reinforcements. We will cut off his resources to the wall and cut down his allies in one decisive strike. And Stannis? Cersei pressed. Do you truly think he'll wait for us to attack? The man is stubborn, but he's not a fool. Stannis has no choice but to stand his ground, Tywin replied, his eyes gleaming with cold calculation. His forces are entrenched in the north, and winter has already begun to take its toll. If he retreats now, he loses face and support. If he advances further south, he leaves himself exposed to our forces. Either way, we will crush him. The key is speed and precision. And after Stannis? Jaime asked. What then? If all goes to plan, we will march directly to Winterfell, Tywin said. Once Stannis is dealt with, the Stark boy will have a choice, bend the knee or suffer the same fate. Either way, the north will be brought back under control. Cersei crossed her arms, her mind spinning with questions and doubts. And what of Daenerys Targaryen? What of her dragons? You're spreading our forces thin, father. Tywin's expression hardened. I am well aware of the risks, Cersei. But this campaign in the north is not optional. If we allow Stannis to gain traction or the Starks to solidify their power, it will only make Daenerys' eventual arrival more dangerous. The north must be subdued now. As for the dragons, I have my own plans in motion to deal with them. They all follow her, without her there is no threat, if she is dealt with their campaign is over. Jaime, sensing the tension between his father and sister, shifted the conversation. What about Tyrion? He asked carefully. He's at Winterfell, isn't he? With Sansa and their son. Tywin's mouth thinned into a hard line. I no longer trust your brother's intentions, he said curtly. He's too entangled with the Starks and their schemes. His loyalties are divided, and divided loyalties are a threat to this house. He poisons that boy. I've long thought Daemon should be brought to the capital to spend some time with his family. Jaime straightened, his voice firm but cautious. Tyrion is a Lannister. He's proven his loyalty time and time again, even when we didn't deserve it. If you take his son from him, you cast him out forever. Tywin's glare could have frozen wildfire. Tyrion will have the opportunity to prove his loyalty one last time. When we reach Winterfell, he will decide whose side he is truly on. If he stands with us, he lives. If he stands against us, his voice trailed off ominously, leaving no doubt as to the outcome. Cersei's lips curled into a cold smirk. If Tyrion has chosen to play the Stark's lapdog, let him suffer the consequences. Jaime shot her a warning look, but she ignored him. Tywin turned to the table, brushing aside a map of Dragonstone to reveal a detailed chart of the north. Enough of this. Prepare yourselves. By this time tomorrow, the Lannister army will be on its way to reclaim order in the north. And once we have secured it, no force in this world, Targaryen or otherwise, will be able to threaten our house. Chapter 56, Roslyn XX. Chapter text. Roslyn XX. Mama. Torrhen's small voice broke the silence, pulling Roslyn from her swirling thoughts. Her gaze snapped to her son, who sat on the floor of the Winterfell nursery, a wooden toy soldier clutched tightly in his chubby hand. His laughter echoed softly off the stone walls, the sound a balm to her weary heart. Roslyn smiled faintly, though the weight of her worries lingered, like shadows clinging to the edges of the firelight. She loved watching Torrhen play. Here, in the warmth of the nursery by the crackling fireplace, with Grey Wind curled protectively beside him, he seemed so carefree. These were the moments she had dreamed of during her long, uncertain days in King's Landing. Back then, she had imagined safety, happiness, and a future full of such simple joys. But now, those dreams were haunted by the cold reality of their precarious existence. Every time Torrhen laughed, played, or nestled into his bed at night, Roslyn couldn't escape the fear that it might be the last time. The thought gnawed at her. She had considered sending Torrhen away, perhaps to Essos or Dorne, where a trusted family could foster him until the tides of war and peril receded. A safe haven, far from the bitter winters and darker threats of the north. But with every resolution to act, doubt overwhelmed her. Roslyn thought of the mothers before her, who had made similar choices, their intentions noble, their sacrifices unimaginable. Rhaenyra Targaryen came to her mind, the queen who had sent her 3 sons away, believing it would save them from the storm of dragons and swords. None returned to her before her death. The stories weighed heavily on her, filling her with dread. If she let Torrhen go, would she ever see him again? Would he forget her voice, her face? Would he feel abandoned, unloved? Her thoughts darkened further. The halls of Winterfell, though steeped in history and tradition, felt like a prison of decisions she did not want to make. Every whisper in the corridors, every glance shared between the lords of the north, reminded her of the precarious balance they lived in. War loomed on the horizon, and with it, uncertainty that extended beyond her. Yet here was Torrhen, untouched by her fears. He was the embodiment of innocence, the reason she endured sleepless nights and restless days. As he moved his toy soldier with a triumphant cry, Grey Wind opened one lazy eye, watching the boy as though the direwolf understood the weight of his presence. Roslyn sighed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Torrhen, she said softly, her voice a mixture of love and sorrow, what story are you telling today? He turned to her with a wide grin. The knight is winning, he declared proudly, holding up his toy soldier. Her heart twisted. If only knights always won, she thought bitterly. A brave knight, is he? She asked, forcing warmth into her voice. Yes, Torrhen said with the certainty only a child could muster. And he'll keep us safe. Roslyn swallowed the lump forming in her throat, her gaze flicking to Grey Wind's watchful eyes. Let him believe that, she thought. Let him keep his innocence just a little longer. Underscore. It was late in the night when Robb finally came to bed, the faint creak of the chamber door pulling Roslyn from a light, restless sleep. The room was dimly lit by the dying embers in the hearth, casting faint shadows that danced across the walls. She stirred, her gaze following him as he entered quietly, shoulders weighed down by exhaustion. In the last few weeks, their time together had been fleeting, reduced to stolen glances in passing or brief exchanges that felt more like duty than connection. Robb had been consumed by the demands of leadership, his presence in their chambers a rarity. Most nights, he took his meals alone in his study, poring over maps and letters, meeting with the lords who had already arrived in Winterfell and writing to those still making their way through the north's harsh terrain. The great hall was constantly filled with voices, lords, bannermen, and envoys demanding his attention, but his seat at their table remained empty. Roslin missed him, not just as her husband but as the man she had come to know and love. The weight he bore, the Lord of Winterfell, the young wolf, was pressing him down, piece by piece. She could see it in the tension in his shoulders, the lines forming around his eyes, the way he moved as if burdened by an invisible chain. Even when he did come to bed, it was long after she had already drifted into uneasy slumber, and by morning, he was gone again, the sheets barely warm where he had lain. Tonight was no different. He crossed the room silently, not wanting to wake her, though she was already awake, watching him in the dim light. He shrugged off his heavy cloak, his movements slow and methodical, as though even the act of undressing required effort he didn't have. His tunic and boots followed, leaving him in only his shirt and breeches as he sank onto the edge of the bed with a weary sigh. Roslin propped herself up on one elbow, her voice soft in the quiet. "You're late again." Rob started slightly, caught off guard to find her awake, but the surprise quickly faded as his expression softened. His tired eyes met hers, and he offered a faint, apologetic smile. "I didn't mean to wake you," he murmured, his voice hoarse from the weight of a long day spent issuing orders and navigating difficult conversations. "I wanted you to," Roslin replied gently, her voice carrying both warmth and a hint of urgency. "I've been waiting to talk to you." Her words lingered in the quiet room, a subtle plea for connection that made him pause. A faint, guilty smile touched his lips as he ran a hand through his auburn hair. "I'm sorry, Roslin. There's just so much to do. The lords, the preparations, everything feels as though it's moving too fast and too slow all at once." She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, a small gesture of comfort. "You don't have to do it all alone, Rob. Let someone else carry some of the weight." He shook his head. "They look to me. If I falter, they'll lose faith. And if they lose faith, everything we've worked for, everything we've lost, it will be for nothing." Roslin's heart ached at his words, at the raw determination and pain she could see in his eyes. "You've already given so much," she said softly. "More than anyone should ever have to. You're a man, not a god. You need rest, Rob. You need to let yourself breathe." For a moment, he didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the fire's dying embers. Then he turned to her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she rarely saw. "I don't know if I remember how to stop," he admitted quietly. "Every moment I'm not fighting or planning feels like I'm wasting time. Time we don't have." She shifted closer, wrapping her arms around him and resting her cheek against his shoulder. "Then let this be your moment to stop," she whispered. "Just for tonight. Let yourself be Rob, not the Lord. Not the general. Just my husband." He hesitated, as if the idea itself was foreign, but then he leaned into her embrace, the tension in his frame easing slightly. She couldn't fight his battles and she couldn't lead his armies, but she could be here, she could hold him not as a warrior or a commander but as a person. _______________________________________________________________________________ The next morning, as the pale Winterfell sun filtered through the frosted windows, Roslin made a quiet but deliberate decision. After breaking her fast with Torrhen, she approached Sansa, who was seated near the hearth embroidering a combination of the Stark and Lannister sigils on a small piece of cloth. "Sansa," Roslin began, her tone warm but determined, "would you mind spending the day with Torrhen? He adores you, and it would mean so much to me." Sansa glanced up, her expression softening at the mention of her nephew. "Of course," she replied with a small smile. "I'd be happy to." Relieved, Roslin knelt to Torrhen's level, brushing a strand of auburn hair from his forehead. "You'll stay with Aunt Sansa today, my little wolf," she said, her voice filled with affection. Torrhen nodded eagerly, already reaching for one of his carved soldiers to show his aunt. With her son in good hands, Roslin allowed herself a moment to exhale. She had made the decision not just to free herself to be with Rob, but because she understood that her role as Lady of Winterfell extended far beyond being a wife and mother. The Northern Lords and their people needed to see her as a figure of strength and unity, someone they could believe in as they faced uncertain times. She found Rob in the Great Hall, standing over a large table laden with maps and parchments, his brow furrowed in concentration. The lords of the north and their bannermen were beginning to arrive in greater numbers, and the weight of preparation was etched into every line of his face. Steeling herself, Roslin entered the hall and approached him with quiet confidence. "Rob," she said softly, drawing his attention. His eyes met hers, and though they still held the shadows of worry, they brightened slightly at the sight of her. "I want to help," she continued before he could protest. "I want to stand beside you, not just as your wife but as the Lady of Winterfell. These men need to see that we are strong together. That I am someone they can trust, someone who stands for the North." Rob hesitated, glancing down at the maps and lists before him, then back at her. For a moment, he seemed on the verge of arguing, of asking her to let him bear the burden alone. But something in her determined gaze made him nod, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Thank you, Roslin," he said at last. "Your presence will mean more than you know, not just to me, but to them." Rob took his seat at the center of the head table, his expression composed but edged with the gravity of the moment. Roslin seated herself beside him, her posture poised and dignified, as she had practiced in the privacy of their chambers. She knew how much appearances mattered now. As the lords of the north began filing into the great hall, she let her gaze move across the gathering crowd, silently testing her memory to put names to faces. Most of the men present had already been at Winterfell for Arya's wedding, or had arrived in the weeks since Rob's call for the banners to assemble. Others had sent their sons to gather their armies while they themselves remained in the castle. Still more were yet to arrive, delayed by distance or duties. Roslin's gaze fell upon a lively cluster near the left side of the hall, where the great Jon Umber stood, his booming laughter cutting through the din of conversation. His towering presence was commanding, his voice rising with unrestrained exuberance as he exchanged loud remarks with his sons. Beside him were Smalljon, broad-shouldered and grizzled, and Alyn Umber, the youngest, now Arya's husband. The three men gestured animatedly, no doubt discussing battle strategies or regaling one another with tales of their might and readiness for the conflicts ahead. Just behind them trailed Arya, her steps deliberate but stiff. By her side walked Aelys Karstark, Smalljon's wife, her hand cradling her noticeably swollen belly. Aelys was speaking earnestly, her face bright with the glow of impending motherhood. Arya, however, seemed only half listening, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. Arya's gown of deep red, trimmed with thick fur, was elegant and well made, bearing the colors of House Umber. Yet it hung on her like an ill-fitting suit of armor. Her discomfort was evident in the way her hands fidgeted, tugging at the sleeves or brushing against the fabric as though it burned her skin. Her frown was subtle but telling, a mixture of frustration and resignation that made Roslin's heart ache. While Alyn himself seemed content to let Arya maintain some of her independent spirit, his father, the great Jon, was not so accommodating. He was a man of staunch tradition, with firm, unyielding views on what it meant to be the wife of a northern nobleman. He had made his expectations clear, and Arya, despite her fierce defiance, was clearly feeling the weight of those demands. It was in the way her shoulders squared against an unseen pressure and the tightness in her jaw, as though she were biting back sharp words. Roslin's gaze softened as she observed Arya, trailing behind the Umber men like a reluctant shadow. She glanced at Aelys, who seemed at ease with her role, one hand protectively on her growing belly as she leaned in closer to Arya, her words lost in the hall's growing clamor. Roslin wondered if Aelys was trying to reassure Arya, or perhaps offer her guidance on navigating this world of obligations and expectations. Arya's eyes flicked up briefly and caught Roslin's across the room. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, and Roslin offered a faint, understanding smile. It was a small gesture, but she hoped it conveyed what words could not, that Arya was not alone in her struggle. Roslin, too, had been forced to grow into a role that felt constraining and foreign, and she knew the quiet pain of bending to the will of a world that expected something other than who you truly were. The hall continued to swell with activity, the hum of voices rising as more lords and their retinues entered, their presence turning the gathering into a bustling tide of northern might. Roslin's gaze moved attentively over the crowd, silently naming faces, banners, and sigils as they passed. Her attention was drawn to the imposing figure of Lord Harry on Karstark as he entered the hall. The young lord, known to many as Lord Harry, cut a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate and assured. On his arm was his wife, a petite woman with pale blonde hair and delicate features, her expression serene despite the formidable atmosphere of the gathering. Harry's father, Lord Ricard, had finally succumbed to a lingering illness that had plagued him for 2 years, leaving Harry on to take up the mantle of leadership. Roslin noted how his sharp eyes scanned the hall, taking in the other assembled lords with a calculated gaze that spoke of both confidence and caution. When his eyes landed on his sister, Alis, and her husband, Small Janumber, his expression softened briefly. Harry inclined his head in acknowledgement, a subtle but warm gesture to his kin before he continued further into the room to take his place. The great doors of the hall swung open once more, heralding the arrival of those who had come to Winterfell within the last day. Robb, ever the dutiful ruler, held court daily to formally welcome the new arrivals and hear their oaths of loyalty or their reports of readiness for the campaign ahead. It was a tradition that reinforced the bonds between the Stark name and their bannermen, one that Roslin quietly admired for its effectiveness in maintaining unity in such precarious times. First among the day's arrivals was the towering figure of Lord Wyman Marndale, his considerable presence commanding attention as he strode into the hall with an air of joviality that belied the seriousness of their gathering. At his side were his 2 sons, Sir Willis and Sir Wendell, their expressions a blend of pride and duty as they walked slightly behind their father. Flanking them were Lord Wyman's 2 granddaughters, each a striking young woman in her own way. Roslin found her gaze drawn to the girls, particularly the younger, Wyler. With her bright green hair, a vibrant hue that seemed almost otherworldly against her pale skin and the grey furs she wore, Wyler stood out like a splash of spring in the wintry hall. When they reached the dais, the entire family bowed low in deference to Robb and Roslin. Lord Wyman's booming voice filled the space as he greeted them warmly. "My lord, my lady," he said, a smile breaking through his thick beard. "Winterfell stands proud once more. Marndale swords and ships are at your service." Robb nodded, offering a few words of thanks, but it was Wyler who drew Roslin's full attention. The young girl stepped forward, a bashful smile playing at her lips as she clutched something small in her hands. "My lady," Wyler began, her voice soft but steady as she addressed Roslin directly. I made this for your son, Torrhen." With that, she extended her hands, revealing a small, carefully crafted toy soldier sewn from scraps of cloth and stuffed to be soft enough for a child to hold. The detail was impressive for something so simple. It bore the Stark direwolf embroidered on its chest, its tiny sword stitched with precision. Roslin's heart warmed at the gesture. She leaned forward to take the toy, her fingers brushing against Wyler's as she accepted it. "Thank you, Wyler," she said, her voice tinged with genuine gratitude. "It's beautiful. Torrhen will treasure it." Wyler blushed at the praise, her cheeks turning a delicate pink as she dipped into another graceful curtsy. She murmured a soft "thank you, my lady," before retreating to stand beside her family. The Marndales were an impressive sight. Lord Wyman's immense presence, flanked by his well-groomed sons and granddaughters, offered a mix of strength and civility. Wyler's sister leaned in to whisper something, and the 2 shared a soft giggle, their youthfulness a refreshing contrast to the somber mood that hung over Winterfell at the present moment. As the Marndales took their leave, a steady stream of other lords and bannermen followed, each pledging loyalty and offering words of support. Mage Mormont entered next, her armor-clad daughters trailing behind her like a formidable shield wall. Roslin had heard of the Mormont women's fearlessness in battle, but seeing them in person, with their broad shoulders, steely gazes, and weapons strapped to their backs, was awe-inspiring. Even the youngest, Lyanna, a girl of barely 15, carried herself with the confidence of a seasoned warrior. Mage offered a curt nod to Robb and Roslin before taking her place among the Northern Lords. Then came Lord Galbert Glover, a steady presence with his brother, Robert, who was his heir. Both men looked tired but resolute, their journey from Deepwood Motte evident in the weariness etched into their faces. They exchanged pleasantries with Robb and Roslin, expressing their gratitude for the hospitality of Winterfell and reaffirming their fealty to House Stark. Finally, the herald's voice echoed once more through the hall, capturing the attention of all who remained. Robb leaned toward Roslin, his voice low but tinged with finality. "These are the last to arrive. The final Northern banners. This is everyone." Roslin nodded, her heart sinking with the weight of those words. This was the sum of their strength, the collective power of the North gathered beneath one roof. The herald cleared his throat and announced the final guests with ceremonial flourish. Presenting the Lord Roose Bolton, Lord of the Dread Fort, with his wife, the Lady Tyta Bolton, and their daughter, Lady Alyssa Bolton. The room fell silent, the weight of anticipation settling over the whole like a heavy blanket. All eyes turned toward the great doors as Roose Bolton entered, his pale, unsettling gaze sweeping the gathered lords and ladies with a predator's calculated detachment. He moved deliberately, each step measured, exuding an eerie calm that was somehow more menacing than any show of force. His presence seemed to draw the warmth from the air, leaving a chill that prickled at the skin, as if the winter winds had followed him indoors. Behind him walked Lady Tita Free, Roslyn's elder sister. Once known for her robust frame and earthy beauty, Tita had transformed over the years. Time, it seemed, had polished her features, giving her an understated yet undeniable elegance. Her face, though still familiar, now held a quiet refinement, a grace that was both regal and grounded. The years had been kind to her, but they had also weathered her in ways Roslyn couldn't fully understand. Tita's life at the Dread Fort had always been shrouded in mystery. Her letters, though frequent, were often vague, carefully worded and never revealing the full truth of her existence under Roose Bolton's roof. Roslyn had long wondered about the woman her sister had become, but any attempt to pry into her life was met with more silence than answers. In Tita's arms was a small bundle, wrapped tightly in black cloth, the sombre colors of House Bolton. The infant's tiny face was barely visible, but Roslyn could see the soft rise and fall of her chest, the peacefulness of her slumber. Alyssa Bolton, Tita and Roose's sole child, lay nestled against her mother's breast, blissfully unaware of the fragile undercurrents pulling at the edges of her family. The presence of the child, so small and innocent, should have been a moment of tenderness, a beacon of hope in a world hardened by violence and bloodshed. But as Tita stepped forward, her eyes meeting Roslyn's with a quiet, almost haunted expression, the air between them thickened. The baby's arrival, instead of symbolizing joy, felt like a delicate flame struggling to stay alight in a storm. As Roslyn's gaze lingered on her sister, another figure emerged from the shadows behind them, unannounced by the herald. The man's mere presence caused a ripple of unease through the room. Ramsay Snow, the bastard of the Dread Fort. He moved with a swagger that contrasted sharply with his father's composed menace, his leering smile a mask for something far darker. Ramsay's eyes roamed the hall with unsettling amusement, as though he saw it all as a game, a board upon which he could play his cruel tricks. His very appearance was jarring, his dark hair unkempt and his clothing just a shade too ragged for the occasion. Tita paused briefly as she approached the high table, her grip tightening on Alyssa. Roslyn could see the slight tremor in her hands, a telltale sign of her nerves. As their eyes met, Tita offered a small, wavering smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Roslyn returned it with warmth she didn't entirely feel, determined to be a steadying presence for her sister despite the growing discomfort Ramsay's presence cast over the hall. When they reached the dais, Roose bowed with that chilling, perfunctory grace of his. "My lord," he said, his voice smooth and flat as a frozen lake. "Lady Stark." He inclined his head toward Roslyn, the gesture devoid of warmth but laden with formality. Tita stepped forward, dipping into a shaky curtsy. "My lord," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My lady," she added, glancing at Roslyn. There was a flicker of gratitude in her gaze, as though she took some comfort in having her sister here in this moment. Roslyn's eyes dropped to the tiny bundle in Tita's arms, her expression softening. "And this must be Lady Alyssa," she said, her voice warm despite the unease in her chest. "She's beautiful." "Thank you," Tita replied, a faint blush touching her pale cheeks. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them, and Roslyn wished she could reach out, pull her sister into a comforting embrace, and shield her from the shadows that loomed so close. Ramsay remained a step behind, his presence a dark stain on the tableau. His gaze flicked briefly to the high table, his lips curling into a smirk that sent a shiver down Roslyn's spine. Rob's posture stiffened beside her, his jaw tightening as he stared at the bastard with thinly veiled disdain. Yet Ramsay seemed unbothered, as though he relished the tension he provoked. "Welcome to Winterfell," Rob said at last, his tone clipped but courteous. His words were addressed to Roose, though his eyes flickered briefly to Tita. "Winterfell is as welcoming as ever," Roose replied, though there was no sincerity in his voice. His pale eyes flicked briefly toward Ramsay before returning to Rob, the exchange unspoken but heavy with meaning. As the Boltons moved to take their seats, Roslyn couldn't help but watch her sister closely, her eyes lingering on Tita's every movement. The difference between them was striking, While Taita walked with a quiet composure, her face impassive, there was an air of tension about her, something fragile beneath the surface. She moved behind her husband, Roos, but not in step with him, almost as if she was trying to maintain some distance, a gap between herself and the man who had claimed her as his wife. And then there was Ramsay. The way he hovered just behind Taita, so close that she must have felt his presence intimately, his body almost brushing against hers with every step. Rosalind's heart tightened as she watched them. If the rumors about Ramsay's behavior were true, if the tales of his cruelty and manipulation had any merit, then her sister's life at the Dread Fort was one Rosalind couldn't even begin to comprehend. Ramsay's gaze never strayed far from Taita, his eyes dark with an intensity that bordered on obsession. It was the kind of look a man gives when he believes he is entitled to everything he sees, and Taita, though married to his father, seemed to be no exception. Rosalind's heart ached as she imagined her sister's life in that grim place. To live under the same roof as two such men, Roos, with his cold, calculated cruelty, and Ramsay, whose sadistic nature had earned him a reputation even in the halls of Winterfell, must have taken a toll on Taita. Robb rose from the table with a commanding presence, his tall frame emanating strength and determination. The quiet murmur of the hall immediately ceased, all eyes turning to their lord. He extended his hand to Rosalind, a gesture both respectful and unifying. She accepted it gracefully, rising to stand beside him, her presence lending quiet support to his authority. "My lords," Robb began, his voice firm and resonant, carrying effortless across the great hall, "my ladies. My wife and I are deeply grateful for your presence here today. To those who remained with us following my sister Arya's wedding, I thank you for your patience and loyalty. And to those who have only just joined us, I commend your haste in answering my call." The lords and ladies nodded, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and reverence. Robb's tone shifted slightly, becoming more personal, almost confessional. "I wish to speak to you all now, as Northerners," he said, his blue eyes sweeping across the room. "In the coming days, my uncle, Lord Edmure Tully, will arrive with the strength of the Riverlands at his back. Their numbers are significant, and their loyalty to our cause is unwavering. But if I may speak plainly, and I hope you will forgive my honesty, they are not Northerners." A ripple of chuckles and nods moved through the crowd, an acknowledgement of the age-old pride in Northern identity. Robb allowed the moment to settle before continuing, his expression growing grave. "The threat we face is unlike any we have known," he said, his voice hardening. "It will not stop, it will not tire, and it will not bargain for peace. The enemy I speak of is death itself, and it comes for us all. The White Walkers are marching south, and if we do not stand united, they will destroy everything we hold dear, our homes, our families, our very lives." For a moment, there was a charged silence, broken only by the crackling of the great hearths. Then came a voice, tinged with disbelief and faint amusement. "White Walkers?" Haryon Karstark called out from his place among the gathered lords, his tone almost mocking. A few others murmured their skepticism, exchanging wary glances. Robb's gaze snapped to Haryon, his expression unyielding. "Aye, White Walkers," he replied, his voice sharp and cutting through the murmurs. "You've heard the tales, I'm sure, legends meant to frighten children. I once thought the same. But my brother, Jon, has seen them. He has fought them. They are real, and they are coming." The hall fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on the gathered lords and ladies. Robb stepped out from behind the table, releasing Rosalind's hand as he addressed the room with a growing intensity. "I do not expect you to believe me because of stories," he continued. "I expect you to believe me because of the loyalty we owe to one another as Northerners. The Night's Watch has confirmed their presence beyond the wall. They have seen the signs, the frozen bodies, the unnatural storms, the terror etched into the faces of survivors. And when they come, they will not care for our banners or bloodlines. Stark or Karstark, Marndale or Glover, Umber or Bolton, it matters not. They will come for us all." Robb's words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. He straightened, his gaze sweeping across the faces of those gathered. "But we are Northerners," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "We have faced worse odds and harsher winters than any other. We do not falter. We do not run. We stand, shoulder to shoulder, because that is who we are. That is what makes the North strong. The room stirred with murmurs of agreement, heads nodding as his words began to resonate. Even Harry on Karstark looked less amused, his brow furrowing in thought. "My uncle's banners will swell our ranks," Robb said, his tone resolute. "But it will be the North that holds the line, the North that decides whether this winter becomes our last. I ask you now, not as your lord but as your kinsman, as a son, as a brother, as a husband and as a father, will you stand with me? Will you fight for the living?" The room erupted in shouts of affirmation, the lords and their retainers pounding fists on the tables, their voices echoing off the high stone walls. The room erupted in a cacophony of shouts, fists slamming against the wooden tables, the sound carrying throughout the great hall like a thunderclap. The force of their collective resolve seemed to shake the very walls of Winterfell, as the Northerners, lords, ladies, and their retainers alike, roared their affirmation. The fierce unity of their response filled the hall, echoing with the ancestral power of a people who had survived centuries of winter, war, and bloodshed. But just as the last of the shouts began to fade, a voice cut through the noise, a deep, cold voice that stilled the room with its calm authority. "Forgive me, my lord." Lord Roose Bolton's pale, unflinching gaze swept over the room as he stepped out from the crowd. His expression was one of cool calculation, his voice measured, as though he were accustomed to speaking in ways that made even the most powerful pause. "But word is that Tywin Lannister is only a few days from making landfall at Eastwatch. His fleet is already on the move, and from there, he intends to storm Castle Black. Then, when he has the wall under his control, he will come for us. What good will we be in this war if Tywin Lannister and his armies cut us down before the so-called dead even pass the wall?" The room grew unnervingly quiet, the murmurs of the lords fading into hesitant silence as Roose Bolton's words took root. There was no denying the truth in what he said. Tywin Lannister, widely known for his ruthlessness and the iron hand with which he ruled, was indeed on the move. His fleet, bolstered by the might of House Valyrian, would soon reach the northern shores, and his sights were set firmly on the north. Robb had made it clear that they would face the threat of the dead, but Bolton's words struck a more immediate and practical concern. How could they fight for survival against the White Walkers when the living threat of Tywin Lannister was drawing nearer with every passing day? Robb's jaw clenched, his brow furrowing as he turned his gaze to Lord Bolton, weighing his words carefully. A sharp tension settled in the room, and Roslyn could feel the shift in the atmosphere. While the Northerners had rallied behind Robb's declaration, Bolton's reminder of their precarious position was a reminder of their vulnerability, not only to the Walkers but also to the Lannisters, who were never far from making war with the North. "How long do you think we can hold Winterfell, my Lord Bolton?" Robb's voice was calm, but the edge of concern was palpable. He had already made plans to unite the North against the undead, but now the threat from Tywin loomed just as large. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of dissent or doubt among his bannermen. "Do you think my father and brother will give up the castle without question?" "Of course not," Bolton said, his gaze never leaving Robb's. "But Tywin's army is seasoned, he will find no difficulty facing the men of the Night's Watch and then have no doubt he will come for us." The tension in the hall deepened, lords exchanging uneasy glances. The weight of the decision hung in the air, whether to devote all their efforts to the coming war against the undead, or to split their forces to face the imminent threat of Tywin Lannister's invasion. It was a choice that could cost them dearly, either way. "We have no choice but to face them as they come," Robb continued, his voice gaining strength as he addressed the room. "But we will do it on our terms. The dead may come, but we will stand against them, just as we stand against the Lannisters. We will not falter." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though there were still furrowed brows and anxious looks exchanged. Lord Bolton, ever the pragmatist, nodded slowly but said no more, his cool demeanor unshaken despite the tension. "We are Northerners," Robb said, his voice rising once more, "and we will hold Winterfell. We will hold the North. Whether it be against Tywin Lannister's armies or the White Walkers, we will face them. And when we do, we will make sure that the North stands." The words hung in the air, resolute and powerful. For a moment, the uncertainty that had crept into the room was pushed aside by the raw, unwavering determination of the Northerners, their loyalty to Robb Stark and their homeland shining through. The lords nodded, some with more conviction than others, but the choice was made. They would face both threats, whatever the cost. Chapter 57, Jon 2. Chapter text. Jon 2. Jon barely slept anymore. Sleep had once been a fleeting escape, a refuge from the burdens of leadership. Now, it was a distant memory, as elusive as the peace that had vanished from his life. When they had first returned to Castle Black, he had tried. He would clench his eyes shut and force his mind to drift away from the looming spectre of war, from the ever-present threat crawling closer with each passing day. But the hours dragged on, and dawn always broke too soon, the light creeping into his room like an unwelcome visitor. After a while, he stopped trying altogether. Instead, he surrendered to the wakefulness, immersing himself in work. His room became a sanctuary of parchment and ink, maps sprawled across every surface. He meticulously crafted plans for every possible scenario, considering every angle, every variable. He devoured ancient texts and obscure accounts, desperate for any scrap of knowledge about the others. Most of it was nonsense, half-forgotten legends, cryptic prophecies, but John read it all. Somewhere in those faded words, there had to be something useful. Something to give them an edge. But even knowledge felt like a feeble shield against the cold truth: they were coming. John had taken to joining the night patrols atop the wall. It wasn't expected of him, the Lord Commander traditionally did not walk the wall like a common ranger. His men had reminded him of that. But John didn't care. He needed the cold, the bite of the wind against his skin, the endless black expanse of the night sky. It was better than the suffocating weight of his quarters, better than staring at the same walls as his thoughts consumed him. The wall was its own kind of solitude, a fortress of ice and stone that seemed to stretch forever into the void. Up there, the world was silent except for the howling wind. John found a grim comfort in that silence. It felt honest. In the early days after John's arrival at Castle Black, John had held on to a fragile hope: perhaps Stannis Baratheon could be reasoned with. He had spent countless hours locked in council with his father, Eddard Stark, and the self-proclaimed king. Every morning, they would gather in the dim light of the Lord Commander's quarters, their voices low but tense. The discussions dragged on until nightfall, leaving John drained and frustrated. They spoke of many things: John's first-hand encounters with the White Walkers, the ancient myths, the grim realities. John described the cold, unnatural blue of the walkers' eyes, the way steel shattered against their frozen forms, and the silent march of the dead. His father added the weight of his own wisdom, recounting the old tales told in Winterfell, warnings passed down through generations. But Stannis was unyielding. Stannis's determination to use Castle Black as his base of operations was unshakable. He had no keep of his own: Dragonstone was lost, Storm's End unreachable. Castle Black, cold and barren as it was, had become his last refuge. "We hold here," Stannis declared during one particularly grueling session. "The wall is a fortress unlike any other. It will serve." John clenched his fists beneath the table, frustration simmering just below the surface. This was redundant. Castle Black was not meant to be a staging ground for a king's war. It was a sentinel against the dark forces beyond the wall, not a chess piece in Stannis' campaign. "Castle Black belongs to the realm, not to any king's ambitions," John said, his voice taut with barely restrained frustration. "The Night's Watch swore an oath, to defend the realms of men, not to fight your wars. We're not here to battle Lannisters or play at crowns." His eyes locked on Stannis, cold and unyielding. "We're fighting something far worse. If we squander our strength on this, we won't live long enough to see another enemy. Death is coming for us all, and it won't wait." Stannis's gaze had been cold, his reply colder. "If I fall, the realm falls." "You're right, Lord Snow, the Night's Watch is sworn to protect the realm. That includes its rightful king." Eddard Stark, ever the diplomat, had tried to mediate. "We need unity, Stannis. Fighting on two fronts will weaken us all." But Stannis's resolve was iron. He would not yield his claim, not for walkers, not for kings, not for anything. John had nearly given up hope when the Raven arrived from Winterfell. Robb's letter, delivered in haste, its seal bearing the direwolf of Stark, was brief but urgent. The words leapt off the page. "Tywin Lannister marches north. He will land at Eastwatch within days." The message struck like a hammer blow. John's heart sank as he read and reread the letter, dread coiling in his stomach. Tywin Lannister's arrival was imminent, and with him would come the full might of the crown. Jon had taken the letter straight to Stannis, laying it before him like a challenge. "You wanted a war, my lord. Now you'll have it." Stannis's eyes flicked over the parchment, his expression unreadable. But Jon saw the flicker of something in the man's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or grim satisfaction. "We hold here," Stannis repeated, his voice steady. "Let him come." Jon exchanged a glance with his father. Eddard's face was a mask of quiet concern, but his eyes mirrored Jon's unease. They both knew what was coming. War was inevitable. And so, preparations began in earnest. The wall became a hive of activity, men sharpening blades, reinforcing defenses, and readying for a siege. Jon watched it all with a heavy heart. He had tried to prevent this. Now all he could do was fight so he could live to face the true enemy. ________________________________________________ The next week passed in a relentless blur, each day bleeding into the next as Jon pushed himself, and his men, to the brink. He didn't want this fight. The very idea of turning Castle Black into a battlefield against living men felt like a betrayal of everything the Night's Watch stood for. But with each dawn, it became clearer that the choice was slipping from his grasp. Tywin Lannister was coming, and so was war. Jon spent his mornings drilling the men in the courtyard, barking orders as they practiced formations and reinforced the gates. The Watch was not an army, but they would have to fight like one. Every sword counted now. Even the greenest recruits, barely able to hold a blade steady, were put to work. Nights were the hardest. He would sit by the hearth, staring into the flames, until his eyes burned from the strain. His father tried to counsel him, but even Ned Stark's calm presence couldn't banish Jon's unease. "How do you prepare for a war you don't believe in?" "I want you to leave," Jon finally muttered, his voice low but firm. Ned froze in place, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "Jon," he began, stepping forward, searching his son's face for any sign of doubt. "What are you talking about?" Jon clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze. "You came here to stand against the dead, not to fight the Lannisters," he said, the strain evident in every word. "If the worst comes to pass, if Castle Black falls, Robb will need you. Winterfell will need you." Ned's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened. "I came here to fight alongside you," he replied, his voice steady, resolute. "And I intend to do that." Jon shook his head, frustration mingling with a deep, aching sadness. "Robb is your son," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "He needs you more than I do. You're his father. He can't face what's coming alone." Ned's gaze didn't waver. He stepped closer, his boots echoing softly against the stone floor. "You are my son," he said, each word spoken with deliberate care. "No matter your blood. You're my son, Jon. And I will stand by you." Jon's throat tightened, and he looked away, blinking back the sting in his eyes. The weight of those words settled deep in his chest, both a comfort and a burden. Ned placed a hand on Jon's shoulder, the grip warm and reassuring. "Now," he said gently, "get some sleep. You'll need your strength." Jon nodded mutely, unable to speak. He felt the warmth of his father's hand linger for a moment longer before Ned turned and walked to the door. The firelight caught the edges of his cloak as he disappeared into the hallway, leaving Jon alone with the quiet and the cold once more. But the room didn't feel quite as empty anymore. By some miracle, Jon had slipped into a restless slumber. It wasn't deep or peaceful, but it was something, a brief, fleeting reprieve from the storm raging within him. For a few precious hours, the weight of his worries eased, if only slightly. Dreams came in fragments, flashes of white snow, ghostly figures, and a distant howl that echoed through the darkness. But he was awoken before dawn. Jon stirred, his eyes fluttering open to the very beginnings of morning light creeping through the narrow window. The faint golden glow hinted at a cold, clear morning, but the chill that hung in the air wasn't what had roused him. No, it was the noise, the distant clatter of wood scraping against stone. The sound was deliberate, heavy, and unrelenting, dragging him fully from his uneasy rest. He pushed himself up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and crossed the room to the window. The cold bit at his skin as he leaned against the ledge, peering down into the courtyard below. What he saw made his stomach twist. Stannis Baratheon stood at the center of the yard, rigid and immovable, his fur-lined cloak billowing in the wind. His face was set in a grim mask, eyes narrowed against the cold. Beside him, like a shadow, was Melisandre. The Red Priestess was draped in crimson, her hair catching the early morning light, making her appear almost otherworldly. Her expression was serene, eerily calm, as though she found comfort in the bitter chill of the war. Jon's gaze shifted to the two Baratheon soldiers struggling to erect a massive pyre in the center of the courtyard. The wood, dark and splintered, groaned as it was hauled into place. They worked in silence, the only sound the scrape and thud of logs being stacked one atop the other. A knot tightened in Jon's chest. He knew what this was. He'd heard the whispers, the rumors among the men. A sacrifice. Melisandre's voice drifted upward, soft and lilting, as she murmured something to Stannis. The king didn't respond, but his jaw clenched, the muscles in his face taut. He looked like a man walking to his doom, though it was someone else who would burn. Jon grabbed his cloak in a rush, his heart pounding as dread clawed at his throat. He strode to the door, ready to confront whoever stood in his way and put an end to whatever dark ritual Melisandre had planned. But when he pulled the handle, the door didn't budge. Locked. He rattled it, trying again and again, but it refused to yield. A surge of frustration and panic welled up inside him as he threw his weight against the wood, his fist slamming into it. Nothing. Breathing hard, he stepped back, his mind racing for another way out. His gaze drifted back to the window. He crossed the room and peered down into the courtyard once more, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what was unfolding below. Melisandre stood, her presence commanding and unnervingly calm. Her crimson robes billowed in the cold wind, a stark contrast against the pale snow-covered ground. She gestured with deliberate precision, her voice carrying softly, though Jon couldn't make out the words. At her command, a group of men, soldiers of Stannis' army, moved toward one of the side chambers. Jon's stomach turned as he watched them disappear inside. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. He clenched his jaw and scanned the courtyard, desperate for some sign of how he could intervene. Then he saw her. Up on a high balcony, distant but unmistakable, stood Queen Lys. She watched the scene unfold below with an expression that chilled Jon to his core. Her face was set in a mask of cold detachment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was no warmth in her eyes, no flicker of doubt. Only grim acceptance. The door to the side chamber creaked open, and Jon's breath hitched as the soldiers emerged, leading someone between them. Shireen. The princess, now 16, walked with quiet grace, her head held high despite the cold wind tugging at her hair. She had grown into a striking young woman, her beauty understated but undeniable. The grayscale scars that marred one side of her face were still visible, but they seemed to enhance her strength rather than diminish it. There was something luminous about her, a kindness and purity that radiated from within. Jon's heart ached at the sight of her. A girl born to be a princess, trapped in a world that had no place for her gentle spirit. Jon pressed his ear to the windowpane, the muffled voices drifting up from the courtyard below, thin but unmistakable. The cold glass bit into his skin, but he ignored it, straining to catch every word. The conversation was chilling in its calmness, an eerie contrast to the dread coiling in Jon's stomach. Princess Melisandre's voice floated up, smooth and gentle, as if she were offering comfort instead of delivering doom. Your father and I are so grateful for your help in this matter. Shireen's voice, steady and sweet despite the circumstances, answered with a quiet resolve. Of course. One day, the Iron Throne will be mine. I must do what I can to help win it. Jon's throat tightened. She doesn't know. She couldn't possibly understand what was about to happen. Stannis remained silent, a looming figure in the shadows, his jaw clenched tight. His gaze was fixed on the pyre, but his face betrayed nothing. No hesitation. No regret. Just cold, unyielding resolve. Melisandre stepped closer to the girl, her red robes rippling like liquid fire. You know, princess, that your father is chosen. Chosen by a power greater than us. His blood is sacred. She paused, her eyes gleaming with an almost fanatical light. And his blood runs in your veins. And therefore your blood has great power. There was a beat of silence, heavy and oppressive. Shireen's eyes, wide and innocent, flicked to her father. "Father," she whispered, seeking reassurance. But Stannis said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any words could. "Don't worry," Princess Melisandre cooed, taking a lock of Shireen's hair and letting it curl around her fingers like a serpent. Her tone was soft, but there was an edge to it, a cold finality. "It will all be over before you know it." And then it happened. The Baratheon men stepped forward. Their movements were hesitant, their faces pale and drawn, but their hands were firm. They grabbed Shireen by the arms, their grip tightening as the girl's calm facade shattered. "No. Stop. Please." Shireen's voice broke, rising into a desperate scream that cut through the morning air like a knife. "Father. Mother. Don't let her do this. Please." Her pleas echoed in the courtyard, bouncing off the cold stone walls. But neither Stannis nor Slyss moved. Slyss stood on the balcony above, her face a mask of detachment, her hands folded tightly at her waist. Jon could see her lips tremble, but she did nothing. She just watched. Stannis remained as still as a statue, his eyes hollow. He didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Jon's heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. "Do something. Someone, do something." But no one moved. The soldiers dragged Shireen toward the pyre, her small form struggling against their grip. Her screams grew more frantic, more guttural. "Father, please. Please, don't let them," she cried, her voice cracking with terror. Jon couldn't take it anymore. He spun away from the window, slamming his shoulder against the locked door with all his strength. The wood groaned under the assault, but it didn't give. He hit it again and again, desperation fueling his efforts. He had to get out. He had to stop this. "Open. Open the damn door," he roared, his fists pounding against the solid wood. His knuckles split, blood smearing across the surface, but he didn't care. He couldn't let this happen. A loud crack echoed from the courtyard. Jon froze, his breath hitching in his throat as he turned back to the window. The soldiers had tied Shireen tightly to the pyre, the rough ropes biting into her wrists and ankles. Her body twisted and jerked as she fought against her restraints, but it was futile. The stakes held firm, leaving her pinned against the rising stack of kindling. Tears streamed down her cheeks, carving paths through the soot and grime that already stained her pale skin. Melisandre, cloaked in red, stepped forward, her presence commanding and otherworldly. Her eyes glowed with fervor as she lifted her arms to the sky, her voice reverberating through the courtyard. "Hear me now, my Lord of Light." The flames from her torch danced in her eyes, casting flickering shadows across her face. "We offer you this innocent child, this daughter of royal blood. Purify her with your holy fire, that her spirit may lend strength to your chosen king, Stannis of the House Baratheon. Accept this token of our faith, and in return, grant us victory." Her voice rose with each word, filled with passion and reverence. "Lead us from the darkness, O Lord of Light. Show us the way." The flames roared hungrily at the base of the pyre, their crackling dance filling the air with a grotesque rhythm, the heat from the fire flickering against the cold morning wind. The acrid scent of burning wood mingled with the metallic tang of fear, settling thick in the air. The cruel light from the fire flickered across Shireen's face, casting sharp shadows that made her anguish all the more vivid, her eyes wide and full of terror. Her body thrashed violently against the ropes, her voice rising in a desperate crescendo of heartbreak. "Please. Please stop," she cried, her words ragged and hoarse. Her cries for mercy echoed across the courtyard, a stark contrast to the cold indifference that surrounded her. Jon's heart ached with every shout, his fists clenched against the window as he watched, helpless, his breath shallow with disbelief and anger. Shireen's pleading eyes turned to her mother, a flicker of hope, however small, still burning within her. "Mother, please," she begged, her voice trembling with desperation. "Mother, don't let her do this. Please, save me." Jon could feel the tension in the air, the frozen silence that followed her plea. His gaze flicked to Slyss, who had been standing motionless on the balcony, her face pale and drawn, a mask of cold resignation. But as she looked down at her daughter, bound and helpless, there was a brief moment of hesitation, a faltering in the stone-like resolve that had held her so far. Jon could see it in the way Slyss's shoulders stiffened, her breath quickening, the tension in her body as she fought against the overwhelming wave of grief and doubt that was washing over her. Slyth's lips parted, a tremor running through her as she finally spoke, almost too softly to be heard. "No. No, we can't," but her voice cracked, and the words she had fought to suppress now spilled out in a broken cry. "This is wrong." The moment stretched out like an eternity, and for the briefest of seconds, Jon thought perhaps there was a flicker of humanity left in the cold woman who had remained silent through it all. His heart caught in his throat as Slyth began to move, her legs carrying her towards the stairs with a frantic, hurried pace. She ran, her feet pounding on the stone as if she could outrun her own dread. She rushed towards her daughter, desperate to reach her, to somehow stop the madness that had taken hold of this wretched moment. But before she could reach the pyre, a strong hand shot out from behind her, gripping her arm firmly. Stannis, his expression unreadable, had intercepted her movement with grim efficiency. "No, Slyth," he said coldly, his voice low but unwavering. "This must be done." Slyth turned to face him, her eyes wild with emotion, her hands trembling as they reached for him. "This is wrong, Stannis." Her voice was thick with despair, the words hanging heavy in the air. "I've changed my mind. We can't do this. Please, we can find another way." For the first time that day, Stannis spoke with more than the dispassion of a man lost in his own conviction. His eyes met hers, cold and distant, yet laced with a grim determination. "We have no other choice, Slyth." His voice was firm, unyielding. "She has the blood of kings in her veins. This must work." Slyth shook her head, her face twisted with anguish. "But at what cost, Stannis? At what cost?" Her body was racked with sobs, her breath shallow, struggling to keep the hysteria at bay. She tried to break free from his grasp, but Stannis held her tight, his expression unreadable. "Lord of Light, protect us," Melisandre's voice echoed, rising above the crackling flames. Her arms were stretched high toward the heavens, her eyes glowing with fervor. "For the night is dark and full of terrors." The words felt empty, hollow, as they echoed through Jon's ears, growing more distant with each passing second. The flames were already licking at the base of Shireen's feet, and Jon could hear her desperate cries growing more frantic. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it deafening in the silence of his room, the world outside slipping into a nightmarish haze. "Please, Father!" Shireen cried, her voice raw and cracked with terror. Jon's hands clenched into fists as he heard her beg, her words breaking in the air like shattered glass. "I don't want to die." Jon's breath caught in his throat. It was a plea Jon had heard countless times, one filled with such pain and desperation it could pierce even the hardest heart. But this wasn't some enemy soldier pleading for their life. This was a child, a young girl who had done nothing but try to survive in a world that had turned against her. The flames spread rapidly, climbing up her legs, the heat of the fire unbearable even from where Jon stood. Shireen's screams became more shrill, more frantic, until they were the only sound that filled Jon's world, drowning out everything else. The fire had already begun to consume her body, and her cries of pain mingled with the roar of the flames. Her wrists were still bound to the stake, and as she thrashed against the ropes, Jon felt his entire body tremble with helpless fury. He turned toward the door, fury surging through him. He slammed his shoulder against it, desperate, again and again, until his body gave way with one final, powerful strike. The door cracked open, and Jon surged forward, adrenaline making him forget everything except the need to save her, to stop this madness. But just as Jon opened his mouth to shout, a voice rang out from the courtyard. "Stop!" The voice was harsh, full of desperation and panic. "What are you doing?" Jon froze, the sound of the voice cutting through his fury like a blade. He turned just in time to see Davos Seaworth, his face a mixture of horror and determination, running toward the pyre. His strides were long, his movements frantic, as if he could reach Shireen in time to stop the unimaginable from happening. But before Davos could get any closer, Baratheon soldiers blocked his path. Their hands were heavy on his shoulders, pulling him back with force, and Jon could hear Davos shout, pleading for them to release him. It was too late. There was nothing anyone could do now. Jon's breath caught in his throat as he watched the flames completely overtake Shireen's small form. She screamed, her voice a tortured cry that cut into Jon's very soul, but as the fire consumed her, the sound of her agony slowly began to fade. The flames surged higher, enveloping her completely, and John's legs moved of their own accord. He ran toward the stairs, unable to control the rage and grief welling up inside him. He didn't care if he was too late, he had to try. By the time John reached the courtyard, it was over. The flames were dying down, but the air was thick with the stench of burning flesh. The courtyard, once filled with life, now seemed like a macabre graveyard. Shirene's body, blackened and burned beyond recognition, lay still. Her cries were no more. The silence that followed her death was suffocating. A guttural scream pierced the silence, it was Sliss. Her voice was raw, filled with such anguish that it was impossible to ignore. She had watched her daughter burn alive, and now, her mind seemed to break beneath the weight of it. Davos stood in the courtyard too, his knees buckling beneath him. He had collapsed, his body trembling with grief as he sobbed, his hands clutched at his face as if he could hide from the horror that had just unfolded before him. His cries were like the cracking of glass, sharp and brittle, his grief raw and unrelenting. But through it all, Stannis and Melisandre remained silent, unmoving. Stannis stood with his arms crossed, his face set in grim resolve, his eyes locked on the burning pyre. He said nothing, but Jon could see the cold calculation in his gaze. This was the price of power, the price Stannis had been willing to pay to pursue his throne. Jon had always known Stannis would go to extreme lengths, but this was something else. Melisandre, the Red Witch, stood beside him, her face blank and unreadable. She had been the one to guide this ritual, the one who had promised that this sacrifice would lead to victory. Yet now, as the flames died down and the charred remnants of the girl's body were all that remained, she didn't flinch. She didn't show any remorse. She simply stood there, her eyes distant, as though the death of an innocent child was just another step in the game they were playing. Jon felt his hands tremble with fury, but it was an impotent rage. There was nothing he could do to change what had happened. Nothing he could do to bring Shireen back. And yet, as he stood there, looking at the aftermath of this grotesque act, a fire sparked within him, a fire that would not be extinguished, no matter how deep the pain ran. Stannis and Melisandre had killed a child in the name of power, and Jon would never forget it. He would make sure the world knew what they had done. Chapter 58, Jon 3. Chapter text. Jon 3. The morning was cold and still, but Castle Black was anything but silent. The courtyard buzzed with frantic energy as men prepared for the inevitable clash. The scent of oil, steel, and sweat mingled with the ever-present chill of the war. Yet beneath the surface hum of preparation, there was a weight that pressed on Jon's soul, a weight born of the night's horror. Jon Snow stood on the balcony, his eyes fixed on the southern horizon. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, even as the wind bit at his face. The memory of Shireen's screams echoed in his mind, a sound so haunting it seemed to ride the wind itself. He tightened his grip on the hilt of Longclaw, the pommel's wolf's head cold beneath his palm. Lord Commander, a voice called from behind him, strained and breathless. Jon turned to find Samwell Tarly, hunched over and panting from the climb up the steps. His cloak fluttered in the icy wind, but it was his face that drew Jon's attention, pale, hollow-eyed, and shadowed by exhaustion. "They've been spotted," Sam managed, between gulps of air. "Scouts say, the Lannisters. They'll be here by midday." Jon nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. We'll use what time we have to finish the defenses." His tone was flat, detached. Sam hesitated, rubbing his gloved hands together as if trying to banish a deeper chill. His gaze lingered on Jon's face, searching for something. "Jon. I can't stop thinking about what happened last night." Jon didn't answer right away. The events of the night hung heavy over them, a grim fog that refused to lift. After Shireen's death, the castle had descended into a kind of stunned silence. Melisandre and Stannis had retreated to the chambers that Stannis had claimed without a word, their faces pale but emotionless. Jon had taken charge, unable to bear the stillness. He woke a handful of the Night's Watch, Sam and Gendry among them. They worked through the night, each task more grim than the last. He remembered Sliss, her grief had shattered whatever strength she had left. She collapsed in the snow, unable to stand, her sobs ragged and unrelenting. Jon had tried to comfort her, but it was Gendry who silently stepped forward, lifting the broken queen in his arms and carrying her back to her chambers. Davos Seaworth had been a different matter. Jon had approached him, hoping to give words of solace or perhaps solidarity. But the knight had brushed past him, his face a mask of rage and sorrow, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He had disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jon with nothing but the echo of his footsteps. When Gendry returned, they had turned their attention to the courtyard. The pyre was nothing but smouldering embers, the air thick with the stench of burned flesh. Together, they moved Shireen's charred remains to the Maestas chambers, their faces grim and silent. Now, as Jon faced Sam, the memories felt like a lead weight pressing on his chest. His voice was low and hollow when he finally spoke. "Neither can I." Sam's lips trembled, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. "She didn't deserve that, Jon. The princess. She was just a girl. She trusted them, and they..." His voice broke entirely, and he fell silent. Jon placed a hand on Sam's shoulder, his grip firm but not unkind. "I know," he said quietly. "She was innocent. But we can't change what's done. We can only make sure it means something." Sam nodded slowly, though his eyes were still wet with unshed tears. "What now?" Jon turned back toward the horizon. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the snow-covered land. "Now we fight. For her. For all of us. To live to fight another day." Sam nodded reluctantly, but Jon could see the weight of guilt in his friend's eyes. He placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. "After the battle, I want you to bury her. Somewhere peaceful. Away from this place. She deserves that much." Sam swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "I'll do it." The castle buzzed with a grim determination. Men rushed to their posts, stringing bows, sharpening swords, and reinforcing the walls. Jon moved through the bustling courtyard, his cloak trailing behind him, a quiet but commanding presence. The men of the Night's Watch and Stannis' forces worked in grim synchronization. Bows were strung, barrels of pitch rolled to defensive positions, and swords sharpened until they gleamed like shards of ice. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of sweat, oil, and the biting cold. Jon offered words of encouragement to those he passed, clapping shoulders, meeting weary eyes with his own resolute gaze. He knew the men needed to see strength in their commander, even if he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. Near the battlements, he spotted Gendry, shoulders straining as he hauled a heavy barrel of pitch. The blacksmith moved with a practiced efficiency, but there was something in his expression, a tension, a simmering anger that hadn't cooled since the night before. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark and distant. "Gendry," Jon called out, stopping a few paces away. Gendry set the barrel down with a grunt, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at Jon, the hardness in his face softening just a little. "Thank you. For last night." Jon met his gaze. "You did what needed to be done." Gendry nodded, but his eyes flickered with something more, regret, maybe. "She deserved better." Jon's throat tightened. "She did." His voice was low, barely more than a whisper. "After the battle, we'll see to her. Properly." Gendry hesitated, his hands resting on his hips. He glanced away, as if steeling himself for something. "Jon," he said, voice quieter now. "Do you know?" Jon frowned. "Know what?" Gendry's gaze locked onto Jon's, the weight of years pressing into the silence between them. "Who I am. Who my father was. I've always wondered if that's why you made me your steward." Jon studied him for a moment, understanding dawning like a distant storm on the horizon. He said at last. "I know. I read the letter your old master sent with you. It told me who you were, and why it should remain a secret." Gendry's shoulders slumped slightly, his eyes dropping to the snow-covered ground. "But that's not why I made you my steward," Jon continued, stepping closer. His voice was steady, firm. "I chose you because you're brave, good, and hard-working. It had nothing to do with the father you never knew." Gendry exhaled, a breath that misted in the cold air. "I've been thinking about Shireen," he admitted, voice heavy with guilt. "She was my cousin, and she never even knew me. To her, I was just another face in a sea of black cloaks. And now she's dead. Jon placed a hand on Gendry's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both carried. "Imagine this," Gendry said, his voice carrying a hint of dry humor beneath the grim tension in the air. "The bastard sons of Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, standing side by side at the end of time." He let out a breath that could have been a laugh, though it lacked any real warmth. "Who'd have thought?" Gendry extended his hand, the calluses and scars a testament to years of hard labor at the forge. The gesture was simple but weighty, a bond forged in the fires of survival, stronger than any blood tie. "It'll be an honor to fight alongside you." Jon hesitated for a heartbeat, eyes flicking between Gendry's outstretched hand and the man himself. The thought of Robert Baratheon, once a king, a warrior, and now a memory, crossed his mind. If Robert knew his bastard son fought alongside the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, he'd likely rise from his grave in fury. But the dead didn't matter now. Only the living did. Jon clasped Gendry's hand firmly. Their grip was strong, solid, and filled with unspoken understanding. "Brothers not by blood, but by fate." "The honor's mine," Jon said, his voice low but resolute. They stood there for a moment longer, two men bound by legacy and circumstance, before a horn's distant call shattered the silence. The Lannisters were closing in. Gendry released Jon's hand and picked up his warhammer, resting it on his shoulder with a grim nod. "Guess it's time." Jon nodded, adjusting the grip on his sword, long claws weight a familiar comfort. Time to fight. Time to hold the line. Together, they walked toward the battlements, where the icy winds of the north howled like a pack of wolves, biting through layers of fur and steel. On the walkway ahead stood Stannis Baratheon, his posture rigid and unyielding, a man forged in duty and ambition. Beside him, Melisandre stood cloaked in red, her hair aflame against the backdrop of winter's chill. Their faces were locked in quiet conversation, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy would soon appear. Neither acknowledged Jon's presence as he approached, but he didn't care. He stopped next to them, the cold making his breath visible in the air. Jon's gaze flicked between them, noting Stannis's clenched jaw and Melisandre's eerie calm. He broke the silence. "My lord," Jon greeted, his voice steady but laced with underlying tension. Stannis turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Your grace," he corrected, his tone as sharp as a blade. Jon's jaw tightened. He met Stannis' glare with one of his own, unflinching. "No king does the things you did," Jon said, his voice low but cutting. Stannis' expression didn't change, but Melisandre was quick to interject. "Sacrifices must be made," she said smoothly, her gaze burning with conviction. "Would you rather one girl die or the whole castle?" Jon's eyes hardened. "And what will her death bring you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Will it give you 100 more men? Will it make the walls of this castle any stronger?" Melisandre's eyes glowed with an unsettling certainty. "When the time comes, the princess sacrifice will turn the tide." Jon scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Be sure to let me know when that happens," he said, sarcasm thick in his voice. He turned his focus back to Stannis, stepping closer, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "But right now, Lord Baratheon, we fight today to survive. If by some miracle you win this battle, know this, the Night's Watch will never call you king." Stannis' mouth twisted into a grim line, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken challenge. Jon lingered a moment longer, his eyes flicking to Melisandre. "You're wrong," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and descended the steps, his cloak billowing behind him like a shadow. As he walked away, he could feel their eyes on his back, the weight of their faith, their madness, and the burden of what lay ahead. The battle was coming. And Jon knew they would all pay the price. The Lannisters had come, and they were unleashing fury as relentless as a storm. Their war horns blared, deep and mournful, echoing across the frozen landscape. They struck with precision, ruthless and unyielding, their gold and crimson banners rippling like flames against the pale, snow-covered expanse. Jon stood atop the battlements, watching the chaos unfold below. The clash of steel on steel, the guttural shouts of men, and the dying screams of the wounded created a cacophony of war. Arrows rained down like black hail from the ramparts, but the Lannister forces pressed forward, their formation tight and disciplined. They had targeted the eastern gate. Jon's heart sank as he saw their battering ram, a monstrous thing of iron and oak, crashing against the weakened structure. It had never fully recovered from the Wilderling siege years ago. Despite Jon's best efforts to reinforce it with scavenged timber and stone, it was a weak spot, and the enemy had exploited it. "Hold the line!" Jon yelled, his voice ragged from hours of barking commands. The men of the Night's Watch, their black cloaks stiffened by the biting cold, scrambled to reinforce the breach, rallying alongside the Baratheon soldiers bearing the burning heart of Stannis Baratheon. But Stannis himself was nowhere to be seen, leaving the soldiers to fight without their commander. They fought with the grim resolve of men who had little choice, but the Lannisters surged forward like an unrelenting tide. The enemy came in waves, pressing harder and harder, their numbers overwhelming and their ferocity unyielding. The gate groaned under the relentless assault, splintering with each brutal impact. Jon could see cracks spiderwebbing across the timber, each one a countdown to disaster. He gritted his teeth, gripping the hilt of Longclaw so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Jon!" Sam's voice called out from behind him. He turned to see his friend, pale-faced and trembling but determined. "They are breaching the lower wall, should we pull back?" "No," Jon said firmly, shaking his head. "If we retreat now, they'll overrun the courtyard. We hold here. We make them bleed for every inch." Sam nodded, though fear flickered in his eyes. He hefted a crossbow, his hands shaking as he loaded it. Below, the gate gave a final, resounding crack and exploded inward. Splinters and debris flew in all directions as the Lannister vanguard surged through, swords gleaming in the pale morning light. Jon didn't hesitate. He vaulted down the steps, landing heavily in the courtyard, and waded into the fray. Longclaw flashed in his hands, the Valyrian steel cutting through the first Lannister soldier who charged him. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the cold air. "Form up!" Jon shouted to the men around him. "Shield wall!" The men scrambled to obey, locking shields together as the Lannisters poured through the breach. It was a desperate defense, a wall of men standing against the tide. Jon fought with everything he had, each swing of Longclaw precise and deadly. But it wasn't enough. He could see more Lannisters flooding through the gate, their numbers overwhelming. Above, archers rained arrows down on the invaders, but the enemy pressed on, pushing Jon and his men back step by step. A horn sounded, a low, mournful note that echoed across the battlefield. Jon's heart clenched. They were inside the castle now. The walls had been breached. The courtyard was chaos, snow-stained red, bodies crumpled underfoot, and the clang of steel filling the air. Jon's breath came in ragged gasps, his limbs aching from the constant battle. He ducked a swing from a Lannister soldier, countering with a swift thrust of Longclaw that sent his opponent sprawling. But there were too many. Every time one fell, another took their place. Jon's muscles burned, his grip on Longclaw slipping as blood, his own and others, coated the hilt. He stumbled, momentarily disoriented, as a spear jabbed toward him. He twisted away just in time, but the force of it knocked him to one knee. "Jon," a voice bellowed. "Gendry." Before Jon could fully register what was happening, Gendry barreled into the fray like a bull. His hammer, a monstrous thing of iron and fury, swung wide, catching the Lannister spearman in the chest with a sickening crunch. The man flew back, collapsing in a heap. Gendry didn't stop. He planted his feet, swinging again and again, driving the Lannisters back with sheer brute strength. "Get up!" Gendry growled, reaching down and yanking Jon to his feet. His eyes were wild, face streaked with blood and soot. "We're not done yet." Jon nodded, breathless but grateful. Together, they stood shoulder to shoulder, holding the line. Gendry's hammer shattered shields and bones, while Jon's long claw danced through the chaos, a blur of Valyrian steel. "We need to push them back." Jon shouted over the din. "Working on it." Gendry grunted, smashing another soldier aside. A Lannister knight in gleaming armor charged at them, sword raised high. Jon ducked under the swing, spinning to deliver a brutal slash across the knight's back. The man staggered but didn't fall. Gendry finished him with a single, crushing blow to the helmet, the metal caving in with a sickening crunch. "We can't hold much longer." Gendry gasped, glancing at Jon. His face was flushed, sweat and blood mingling on his brow. Jon's gaze swept across the carnage. The battle was slipping away from them. Lannister forces pressed harder, their relentless tide driving the defenders back toward the keep. The stench of blood and burning pitch hung heavy in the air, mixing with the screams of the dying. "We need to fall back," Jon barked, parrying a blow from a mace-wielding soldier. The clash of steel against Valyrian steel sent a jolt through his arm. "We can't hold them here." Gendry nodded grimly, his hammer striking down another foe. "Go. I'll cover you." Jon hesitated but knew there was no choice. He couldn't afford to lose more men, and Gendry would hold the line as long as he could. Jon turned, sprinting toward the inner courtyard. The gate had fallen, but they could still regroup inside. He passed clusters of Night's Watch brothers and Baratheon men fighting desperately, many falling where they stood. In the distance, Jon spotted Samwell Tarly, frantically trying to shepherd a group of wounded men toward the inner keep. Sam's face was a mask of fear and determination, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead as he hauled a limping brother across the snowy ground. "Come on, move," Sam urged, his voice trembling but resolute. He was doing everything he could to get them to safety, his own fear buried beneath the weight of duty. Jon sprinted toward him, cutting down a pair of Lannisters that had broken through the line. "Sam! Get them inside! Hurry!" "I'm trying." Sam gasped, his breath coming in ragged gulps. The wounded man in his arms groaned, collapsing as they reached the base of the keep. Sam dropped to his knees, struggling to lift him again. Jon grabbed the fallen man, slinging him over his shoulder. "Go, Sam. I've got him." Sam nodded, stumbling to his feet and helping another injured brother. They were nearly there. Just a few more steps. Then, Jon saw the danger too late. A Lannister soldier, sword drawn, broke through the line and charged at Sam. "Sam, behind you!" Jon shouted, but the warning came too late. The soldier drove his blade into Sam's side, the steel sliding in with a sickening ease. Sam gasped, his eyes wide with shock. He staggered back, clutching at the wound as blood seeped through his fingers. The wounded brother beside him collapsed, forgotten. "No!" Jon roared, dropping the man he carried and charging forward. Longclaw flashed in the morning light, cutting the Lannister down in one savage strike. The soldier crumpled, but the damage was done. Jon dropped to his knees beside Sam. "Sam! Stay with me. You're going to be fine." Sam's lips trembled, his eyes glassy. "Jon! I tried to get them safe." "You did," Jon said, his voice breaking. He pressed his hands over the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood, but it was useless. "You did everything you could." Sam's hand reached up, grasping weakly at Jon's arm. There was a faint, sad smile on his face. "Take care of them, the brothers. And Gilly, tell her I'm sorry that I couldn't save her or her baby." "No," Jon whispered, shaking his head. "You're going to tell her yourself. Stay with me, Sam." But Sam's eyes fluttered closed, his body going limp in Jon's arms. The world seemed to blur, the sounds of battle fading to a distant roar. Jon held him, numb with grief, his friend's lifeless form cradled against him. Gendry's voice snapped him back to reality. "Jon! We have to go." Jon gently laid Sam down, brushing a hand over his friend's face. There was no time for grief, not now. He stood, his heart hardened, and turned back to the battle. "Fall back!" Jon shouted, his voice like thunder. "To the keep! Now!" The survivors obeyed, retreating into the inner keep as the Lannisters pressed closer. Jon cast one last glance at Sam's body, promising himself that they would honor him, when, and if, they survived. The last of the defenders trickled into the inner courtyard, the massive doors of Castle Black slamming shut behind them with a bone-shaking thud. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. The wounded were scattered everywhere, men bleeding heavily, their groans filling the air, while others leaned against the cold stone walls, their chests heaving as they tried to regain their breath. Jon stood among them, his gaze sweeping over the carnage. His eyes landed on his father, crouched in a corner, tending to a Baratheon soldier with a deep gash across his forehead. The air inside was thick with the scent of blood and fear, a heavy reminder that they were far from safe. For a brief moment, Jon felt a flicker of relief. At least they were inside the walls, at least they had a chance. But that fleeting sense of safety quickly faded, replaced by the weight of his thoughts. Sam's death gnawed at him, the loss of his friend still too raw. And the rest of his brothers, the men of the Watch, had fought valiantly, but Tywin's forces were relentless, closing in from every direction. Castle Black's walls felt more like a trap than a fortress. The Lannisters were not done yet, and neither was the Nightmare. The group made their way further into the keep, where Stannis Baratheon and Melisandre stood by the roaring hearth in the great hall. Melisandre's gaze was fixed on the flames, her eyes distant, almost trance-like as the fire flickered with unnatural colors. The room was eerily silent except for the crackling of the flames and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing through the stone walls. Jon's heart tightened at the sight of her. The ghost of Shireen's death hung him, like a curse that no one could shake. The young princess' screams still echoed in his mind, the image of her charred body burned into his memory. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. Melisandre spoke, her voice soft, yet carrying an unsettling power. Her death, it was not enough, she murmured, staring into the fire with a strange, almost reverent expression on her face. The Lord of Light demands more. Her words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Stannis, standing at her side, remained silent for a moment, his face grim and hard. But Jon could see the conflict in his eyes, the weariness of a man who had lost his way but could not turn back. Then Stannis' eyes flicked toward the doorway. Gendry had just entered, his hammer still hanging from his side, a bloody, grim expression on his face. The sight of him made Jon's chest tighten. Gendry was one of the best men left in the Watch, and now, his fate was about to take a dark turn. Stannis' eyes narrowed. Recognition flickered in his gaze. "You," Stannis said, his voice low, as if the name had only just dawned on him. "You're my brother's bastard, aren't you?" Jon froze, his blood running cold. He had been so focused on the fight and the carnage outside that he hadn't even thought about Gendry's identity. But now it was clear. Stannis was staring at the blacksmith. Melisandre stood behind him, her lips curling into a tight, calculating smile. "I am," Gendry said, his voice tight but steady. He lifted his chin, defiant, but Jon could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. "You're a part of the blood that runs through the Baratheon line," Stannis said, his voice growing more confident. "And the Lord of Light demands sacrifice. You will serve to fulfill it." Jon's blood ran colder. He knew exactly where this was headed. Gendry's blood was the key to Melisandre's twisted vision of salvation, just as Shireen's had been. "No!" Jon shouted, stepping forward, his hand instinctively reaching for Longclaw. His heart pounded in his chest, and a surge of protectiveness flared within him. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. Before anyone could react, Davos Seaworth appeared from the shadows, his face pale and drawn, his breath ragged from the battle. He had seen enough bloodshed for one day, but he wasn't about to stand by while another innocent life was sacrificed. "Enough of this." Davos's voice rang out, full of authority and fury. "The boy is not for your flames." Stannis' face twisted in irritation. "You speak out of turn, Seaworth. Do you think I am blind to the suffering we must endure? This is the path the Lord of Light has set for us. The sacrifice will be made, and with it, we will win this war." "No," Jon said, stepping forward, his voice low but filled with determination. "We don't sacrifice anyone else, Stannis. We fight. We survive." Stannis glared at Jon, but Jon didn't flinch. His grip on Longclaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "You've already lost your daughter, Stannis. Don't throw away another life. Gendry has nothing to do with your fire god's plan. He's a blacksmith. A man who's bled and fought beside us. He's not a sacrifice." Melisandre, her eyes still locked on Gendry, spoke quietly, her voice like silk. "We cannot ignore the will of the Lord of Light. The power of the King's blood will protect us." Jon turned to Davos, seeking the knight's support. Davos's face was hard, his jaw clenched, but he spoke with a quiet conviction. "She's wrong, Stannis. Sacrificing Gendry won't bring you victory. It'll only damn us all. You've already made your sacrifice. It's time to focus on saving the lives that are still here, not throwing them away for some prophecy. Stannis's eyes flicked between Jon, Davos, and the still silent Melisandre. The weight of their words seemed to sink in, but his pride was a heavy burden, and it took everything in Jon to hold his ground. Stannis Baratheon's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white, but instead of drawing it in anger, he released a long, ragged breath. His shoulders sagged slightly as the weight of his grief pressed down on him, but his voice was firm, filled with cold resolve. "Enough," he said, his voice grating. "You're right, I will not sacrifice a strong fighting man for the chance it appeases some foreign god. Not when that man might be the only family I have left." Melisandre, standing just a few paces away, took a step forward, her crimson robes flowing around her like the shadow of a flame. She opened her mouth to protest, to plead with him once more, but Stannis cut her off sharply, his voice like a lash. "No," he said, the word cold and final. "I've listened to your promises for far too long, whore. Since the day you entered my life, I've known nothing but death, loss, and horror. You told me I was the one, the chosen one. You told me I was meant to lead, to save this realm, and all I've gained is more pain than any man should bear. I lost both my brothers. My only child. You have led me down a path of nothing but ruin." He took a long step toward her, his eyes burning with fury, not at her specifically, but at the years of despair that had followed her presence. "Everything I've done has been for the throne, for my family, and all I have to show for it is ashes. So no more. I will not offer up another life for your god's whims. I will fight with the men who still stand with me, and I will see this war through to the end without your sorcery or your prophecies." A smile spread slowly across Melisandre's face, her lips curving with a quiet satisfaction. She stepped closer to Stannis, her fingers gently brushing his jaw, her touch light, as if trying to soothe the tension in him. Then, with an almost tender gesture, she pressed a soft kiss to his lips. "That's all right, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice low and filled with quiet assurance. "That is why I am here, to do what you cannot, to bear the weight that you cannot carry alone." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a fleeting glimpse of tenderness behind the coolness that usually defined her. But the moment shattered in a heartbeat. Without warning, her hand shot toward her waist, and a gleaming dagger appeared from the folds of her crimson gown. She moved with terrifying speed, her dark eyes locked on Gendry, the target of her devotion and her sacrifice. Jon Snow's instincts screamed as he watched her, and before anyone could react, he surged forward, his body a blur as he intercepted her, his hand grabbing her wrist with the strength of desperation. The dagger fell from her grasp, its blade clattering loudly against the stone floor as Jon twisted her arm aside. The cold steel slid across the rough stone, ringing out in the tense silence that followed. Two of Stannis' men rushed forward, their hands quickly closing around her arms to restrain her, their grip firm as they forced her back. She struggled, but their hold was unyielding. "Take her out of my sight," Stannis commanded, his voice a hoarse rasp of frustration. His gaze flickered to Jon briefly, a hint of gratitude in his eyes, but his expression remained hard. "I will deal with her after the battle is won." Melisandre, her lips curling into a faint, cryptic smile, was dragged away by the men, her eyes never leaving Stannis as she was pulled out of the chamber. As she was taken from his presence, she called out one last time, her voice carrying an eerie calmness despite the chaotic scene unfolding around her. "I forgive you, Your Grace," she said, her words laced with a strange sense of finality. "Your mind has been poisoned, but you will see the light again. The Lord of Light will guide you, even if it takes time." Her words hung in the air as she disappeared from view, leaving only silence and the lingering tension that wrapped itself around the room. Stannis stood motionless, his face drawn in lines of weariness and resolve, the battle ahead still weighing heavily on him. Jon's heart raced, and though he had acted to save Gendry, a new sense of dread settled over him. What had been set into motion, with or without Melisandre's twisted hand, was now beyond anyone's control. The firelight flickered off Stannis' stern face as he stepped forward, addressing the room. His voice, once so sure and filled with the certainty of his divine right, now held the weight of the crumbling walls of his dreams. "I have made mistakes," Stannis said, his voice raspy, but clear. The words fell from his lips with a surprising humility, as though the weight of Shireen's death had cracked the shell of pride around his heart. That's clear to me now. Jon's heart sank as he watched the king's gaze drift over the room, the weight of his failures hanging heavily in the air. The room fell silent, every man in the room sensing the change in Stannis' demeanor. I will be king because it is my right, not because some otherworldly force would put me there, Stannis continued, his voice still firm, but without the conviction it had once held. There are men out there who want us dead, and they will keep coming. Don't fight for me. The gods know I don't deserve it. Fight for yourselves. Fight to survive. The room remained still. The men who had once rallied to his banner, who had seen him as the one true king, now looked to each other, uncertain. They were still trapped in the heart of Castle Black, surrounded by the enemy. Their fate had always been uncertain, but now, it felt like something had broken. Jon could feel it, a shift, as though a door had closed on a past he didn't fully understand. Stannis stepped back, his shoulders slumping slightly, the weight of his decision pressing on him. Now Stannis growled, sliding his sword from its scabbard. The blade gleamed cold and unforgiving in the torchlight. He adjusted the weight of his helm before fitting it onto his head, the stag crowned in shadow. His eyes burned with grim determination as he gave a final glance to the men gathered around him. Let's get out there, and kill some fucking Lannisters. The words ignited a surge of energy through the room. The men, weary but resolute, pushed to their feet, gripping weapons slick with sweat and blood. Shields were raised, swords lifted high, and the faintest whispers of oaths to gods, old and new, filled the air. Jon Snow stood among them, the chaos outside muted in his ears as he focused on the task ahead. The battering at the doors, relentless, rhythmic, like a drumbeat of death, resurfaced, loud and urgent. His heart raced, but his resolve hardened. He turned to his father, Eddard Stark, standing in the corner, the massive blade ice resting heavily in his hands. Ned met Jon's gaze, offering a brief, solemn nod as he wiped the last streaks of blood from the ancient Valyrian steel. Stannis, now fully armored and every inch the battle-hardened king, strode toward the heavy doors barring the way to the courtyard. His gauntlet hand pressed against the wood, feeling the vibrations of the siege beyond. With a sharp intake of breath, he bellowed, "Open it." The door swung wide, and without hesitation, Stannis charged into the fray, a roaring warrior meeting the red tide head-on. The cold night air bit at their faces, but the fire in their veins kept the chill at bay. The courtyard was awash with Lannister soldiers, but the men of the north and the Baratheon forces surged forward, determined to carve their way through. Jon followed, longclaw in hand, its familiar weight an anchor in the madness. His boots pounded against the frostbitten ground as he collided with the enemy. Around him, swords clashed, shields splintered, and the air filled with the deafening sounds of war. He caught sight of Stannis cutting down a Lannister knight, the king's sword a blur of deadly precision. The men behind him, fueled by their commander's ferocity, surged after him, turning the courtyard into a maelstrom of chaos and blood. Jon's focus narrowed as he parried a blow aimed at his head, countering with a swift slash that sent his opponent crumpling to the ground. He moved with purpose, each strike fueled by a need not just to survive but to protect those fighting alongside him. In this moment, nothing else mattered but the next swing, the next breath, the next heartbeat. The storm of battle had descended, and there was no turning back. Jon moved with a practiced efficiency, Longclaw carving a path through the chaos. The courtyard of Castle Black was a blur of red and black cloaks, flames from toppled braziers casting flickering shadows on the blood-slicked ground. Around him, men screamed and fell, steel crashing against steel in a cacophony of death. Across the battlefield, Stannis stood out like a beacon of rage and determination. His stag-emblazoned cloak billowed behind him as he hacked through a cluster of Lannister soldiers. Blood stained his armor, but he pressed forward, unstoppable. Jon could see the fire in his eyes, the desperate, furious need to win, to survive. "For King Stannis," shouted a voice nearby. Jon turned just in time to see a Baratheon bannerman fall, skewered by a Lannister pike. Gritting his teeth, Jon slashed through the attacker, the momentum of the battle pulling him further into the fray. Then he saw him, Jaime Lannister. The Kingslayer cut through the chaos with a grace that belied the brutality of his purpose. His golden armor gleamed even in the dim torchlight, and his movements were fluid, efficient, deadly. Jaime's eyes were locked on Stannis, and Jon knew what was coming. "Stannis!" Jon roared, but his voice was swallowed by the noise of the battle. Stannis was relentless, driving his sword into another soldier, but as he turned, Jaime was there. The two men met in a clash of steel, sparks flying as their swords collided. The world seemed to narrow around them, the battle fading into a blur as the two commanders faced off. Jaime moved first, striking low, testing Stannis's defenses. Stannis parried, the force of the blow sending a shudder up his arm. He countered with a powerful overhead swing, but Jaime sidestepped, his golden hand catching the light as he deflected the strike with practiced ease. "You're too old for this," Baratheon Jaime taunted, his voice cold and detached. "And you're still a Kingslayer," Stannis growled back, slashing at Jaime's midsection. Jaime dodged, but the tip of Stannis's sword caught his armor, leaving a shallow dent. The duel was brutal, each man giving no quarter. Stannis fought with sheer will, every blow fueled by rage and desperation. Jaime, however, was calm, methodical. He knew the outcome already, it was written in the precision of his movements, the confidence in his stance. Jon tried to push toward them, cutting through a wall of Lannister soldiers, but more poured in to block his path. He was forced to defend himself, each second feeling like an eternity as he watched the duel unfold. Stannis lunged, but Jaime caught the blade on his own, twisting it away and stepping inside Stannis's guard. With a swift, brutal motion, Jaime drove his sword into Stannis's side. Stannis staggered, blood pouring from the wound. He tried to swing again, but Jaime knocked the blade from his hand, sending it clattering to the ground. Stannis fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You think this changes anything?" Stannis rasped, his voice defiant even in defeat. "The dead are coming." Jaime tilted his head, considering the dying king. "Let them come," he said quietly. Then, with a final, merciful thrust, he ended Stannis's life. Jon's heart sank as he saw Stannis fall. He roared in fury, cutting down the last of the soldiers barring his path, but it was too late. Jaime stood over the fallen king, blood dripping from his sword, his expression unreadable. Jon surged forward, rage driving him through the throng of Lannister soldiers. Stannis was dead. His body lay crumpled in the mud, a crimson pool spreading beneath him, steam rising as his blood met the frigid air. "Come on, then," Jon roared, pointing Longclaw at Jaime, but the Kingslayer merely glanced at him before turning and vanishing into the melee. More Lannister soldiers poured into the courtyard, surrounding Jon and what remained of the Night's Watch and Baratheon men. He fought with the fury of a cornered wolf, each swing of Longclaw felling another foe. But the tide was against him. His limbs burned, his breath ragged in his chest. Blood, some his own, some not, dripped from his face. A sharp voice cut through the din. Kevan Lannister, armored in gleaming steel, strode toward Jon, his crimson cloak billowing behind him. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Jon with a predator's intent. "Snow," Kevan called, his voice cutting through the clash of swords. "You've fought well enough for a bastard. But it ends here. Yield, and I'll show mercy. Resist, and I'll mount your head on a spike alongside your father's." Jon spat blood onto the frozen ground. "I think I can take an old lion." Kevan nodded once, almost approvingly. "So be it." The older knight moved with surprising speed, his sword flashing as he advanced on Jon. Their blades clashed, the sound ringing out like a hammer on an anvil. Kevan was skilled, every strike precise, every movement deliberate. Jon found himself driven back, struggling to keep up with the relentless onslaught. Longclaw's weight was familiar in Jon's hands, but Kevan's experience was evident. The older man pressed him hard, forcing Jon to parry blow after blow. Each impact sent tremors up his arms, his muscles screaming in protest. "You're no Stark," Kevan growled, lunging forward. "Just a stray wolf." Jon gritted his teeth, sidestepping the thrust and swinging for Kevan's side. The older man deflected the blow, countering with a slash that nearly caught Jon's throat. "You think your family name means anything?" Kevan sneered, circling. "This is the real world, Snow. Honor doesn't win battles. Strength does." Jon barely blocked another strike, stumbling back. Kevan saw the opening and moved in for the kill. A blur of motion, Ned Stark appeared, sword in hand. Ice met Kevan's blade in a brutal clash. Kevan staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Ned didn't give him a moment to recover. "Ned Stark," Kevan hissed, regaining his footing. "We should have put you down years ago." "You should have," Ned replied grimly, pressing the attack. His strikes were relentless, each blow driving Kevan further back. The two men circled, their swords flashing in the firelight. Kevan lunged, aiming for Ned's heart. Ned twisted, the blade grazing his side, but he didn't falter. With a final, decisive swing, he brought ice down, cleaving through Kevan's guard and sinking the blade deep into his chest. Kevan gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. He crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Ned swayed on his feet, his hand clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his tunic. John rushed to his father's side, catching him before he could fall. "Father," John said, panic tightening his throat. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," Ned muttered, though his face was pale. His eyes, however, were sharp and clear. "The battle isn't over, John. We need to." Before he could finish, another wave of Lannister soldiers swarmed into the courtyard. John tightened his grip on Longclaw, standing protectively over his father. "Not today," John whispered, readying himself for the fight. Ned straightened, despite the pain, and together they faced the oncoming tide. Across the battlefield, Tywin Lannister strode forward, his red and golden armor gleaming despite the blood and mud caking it. His face was impassive, a marble mask of command. The chaos of battle swirled around him, but Tywin moved with purpose, untouched by the melee, his eyes scanning for key threats. Jon's breath caught as he saw Gendry, hammer in hand, break through the Lannister ranks. The bastard son of King Robert was a force of nature, swinging his weapon with brutal efficiency, each strike felling another knight. His path cut straight toward Tywin. "Jon," Ned rasped, his voice weak. "Help the boy." Jon nodded and surged forward, but the press of bodies slowed his advance. He could only watch as Gendry closed the distance. Tywin turned, his cold gaze falling on Gendry with faint disdain. "You're one of Robert's," he said, almost casually. "I see the resemblance. But you're a fool if you think you can challenge me." Gendry didn't respond. He raised his hammer and charged. Tywin drew his sword with a fluid, practiced motion, meeting Gendry's first swing with a resounding clash. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through the air, but Tywin held firm, his years of experience evident in every calculated movement. Gendry pressed the attack, hammer swinging in brutal arcs, but Tywin parried each strike, his expression never changing. "You fight like a blacksmith," Tywin sneered, deflecting another blow and slashing at Gendry's leg. The younger man stumbled but didn't fall. "And you talk too much," Gendry growled, feinting a swing before driving the hammer upward in a vicious arc. Tywin reacted a second too late. The hammer caught him on the wrist, the impact so powerful that it shattered the armor and bone beneath. With a sickening crunch, Tywin's sword fell from his grasp, and a scream tore from his throat as the hammer followed through, obliterating the hand. Tywin crumpled to one knee, clutching the bloody mass. His face, so often a mask of unshakable composure, twisted in agony. Gendry raised his hammer for the killing blow, but a sudden surge of Lannister soldiers closed in, forcing him to retreat. Jon, having finally broken free of the melee, reached Gendry's side and helped fend off the attackers. "Leave him!" Jon shouted, dragging Gendry back. "He's beaten. We need to regroup." Gendry hesitated, his eyes blazing with fury, but he nodded. Together, they fought their way back to the inner line of defenders. Tywin, still on his knees, glared after them, his face pale but resolute. Blood poured from his wrist, staining the snow at his feet. Kevan's lifeless body lay nearby, and Jaime was nowhere in sight. The din of battle continued to echo through the courtyard, but Jon could feel the shift in momentum. The defenders of Castle Black were outnumbered and weary, their lines faltering with each passing moment. Beside him, Gendry still gripped his hammer, blood splattered across his face, while Ned stood with ice, though each breath he took seemed a laborious effort. A sudden clang of steel on steel drew Jon's attention. The crowd of Lannister soldiers parted, and Jaime Lannister strode forward, his gilded armor gleaming, a confident smirk playing on his lips despite the carnage around him. His sword was already slick with blood. "Snow," Jaime called out, his voice carrying over the chaos. "You look tired." Care for a quick lesson before it's all over. Jon's jaw clenched, fury simmering beneath the surface. He stepped forward, long claw glinting in the pale light. Gendry is right, you Lannisters really do talk too much, he replied, echoing Gendry's earlier words. Jaime chuckled, twirling his sword lazily. I've heard that before. Let's see if you fight better than you quip. Without warning, Jaime lunged. Jon met him head-on, their blades clashing in a spray of sparks. Jaime's strikes were fast and precise, his years of experience evident in every movement. Jon, though younger and less refined, fought with sheer grit, using every ounce of strength to parry and counter. Jaime feinted left, then brought his sword around in a wide arc. Jon barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as the blade narrowly missed his throat. He retaliated with a downward slash, but Jaime sidestepped, smirking as if enjoying the challenge. You're good, Jaime admitted, circling Jon. But not good enough. Jon didn't respond, focusing instead on Jaime's movements, searching for any sign of weakness. The fight continued, a brutal dance of steel and sweat, each combatant pushing the other to the brink. Suddenly, Jaime's blade found an opening, slicing a shallow line across Jon's side. He grunted in pain but held his ground, refusing to falter. Longclaw came up again, blocking Jaime's next attack. From the corner of his eye, Jon saw movement. Ghost emerged from the shadows, the great white direwolf snarling as he leapt toward Jaime, teeth bared. Jaime stumbled back, caught off guard, but before Ghost could reach him, a Lannister archer loosed an arrow. The arrow struck Ghost in the side, and the direwolf let out a pained yelp, collapsing to the ground. No! Jon roared, his rage surging. He lashed out at Jaime with renewed ferocity, driving him back several paces. But the loss of blood and exhaustion slowed Jon's movements, and Jaime seized the opportunity, disarming him with a swift, brutal strike. Longclaw clattered to the ground. Jon fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his eyes darting to Ghost, who lay motionless in the snow. The sight tore at his heart, but there was no time to mourn. Yield, Jaime said, his sword pointed at Jon's throat. It's over. Jon looked around the courtyard, the scene around him a grim tableau of defeat. Bodies littered the snow, the blood of fallen brothers staining the ground a dark crimson. His father, Ned Stark, was being hauled to his feet by a group of Lannister soldiers. His face was bruised, his breathing labored, but his eyes, grey and fierce, still burned with defiance. Ice, his great sword, lay discarded a few feet away, glinting faintly in the pale light, now just another relic of a lost battle. Near the far wall, Davos Seaworth and Gendry stood side by side, their backs straight despite the ring of soldiers encircling them. Jon saw the tension in their faces, the unspoken acknowledgement that the fight was over. After a brief, shared glance, they slowly lowered their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The clang of Gendry's hammer hitting the ground echoed like a final note in a dirge. Around them, the last remnants of the Night's Watch and Baratheon forces followed suit, laying down swords and shields, the weight of defeat heavy on their shoulders. Some staggered, bleeding and broken, while others sank to their knees, exhausted and resigned. Jon's hands clenched into fists, but he knew the truth. The Lannisters had won. Reluctantly, Jon bowed his head. I yield, he muttered, the words tasting like ash. Jaime nodded, stepping back. Smart choice. Lannister soldiers swarmed in, binding Jon's hands behind his back. They did the same to Ned, Gendry, and the other survivors. Tywin Lannister, pale but still standing despite the loss of his hand, approached, his gaze cold and unfeeling. Take them, Tywin ordered. Alive. As Jon was dragged away, his eyes lingered on Ghost's still form, a hollow ache settling in his chest. Winter would come for them all, and now there was nothing to stop them. Chapter 59, Jon 4. Chapter text. Jon 4. Night fell, and with it came the deep, bone-chilling cold that only the wall could conjure. The biting wind howled through the cracks in the stone, rattling the iron bars of the cells beneath Castle Black. Darkness swallowed the fortress whole, save for the faint, flickering glow of distant torches casting long shadows across the walls. Inside the cells, the air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and defeat. The stones beneath them were slick with frost, and each breath hung in the air like a ghostly mist. Castle Black had always been cold, but tonight, It felt like a tomb. Jon Snow sat against the far wall, his back pressed to the icy stone, trying to suppress the shivers that racked his body. His black cloak, now torn and stiff with dried blood, offered little protection from the freezing air. His gaze drifted to the others huddled in the cell. Ned Stark sat nearby, leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale and drawn. The lines of worry etched into his features seemed deeper now, his eyes hollow with grief. Despite the cold, he hadn't wrapped himself in his cloak, instead resting it over a wounded Baratheon soldier who had collapsed beside him. Davos Seaworth crouched in the corner, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His fingers, rough and calloused from years at sea, trembled as he worked to bind a gash on his forearm with a strip of cloth torn from his tunic. The smuggler's usual composure was gone, replaced by a grim determination to survive. Gendry sat cross-legged near the barred door, staring blankly at the floor. His face was smeared with soot and blood, his lips cracked from the cold. He held a smith's hammer in his lap, his fingers curling around it tightly, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. Of the hundreds who had stood against the Lannister forces that morning, only 50 had survived the slaughter. Brothers of the Night's Watch and Baratheon soldiers alike now shared this grim fate, their numbers dwindled to a mere shadow of what they once were. The cell was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of a wounded man or the distant echo of footsteps above. No one spoke. Words felt meaningless after what they had endured. The battle had been nothing short of a massacre, a relentless tide of Lannister soldiers crashing against them until there was nothing left to fight with. Jon closed his eyes, the images flashing in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He saw Sam's face, wide-eyed and blooded, as he fell. The sound of Ghost's final, heart-wrenching howl still echoed in his ears. A sharp intake of breath pulled Jon from his thoughts. It was Ned, stirring slightly, his gaze meeting Jon's across the dim cell. "We did what we could," Ned said softly, his voice hoarse but steady. "We held as long as we could." Jon nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. His throat was tight, choked with guilt and frustration. Davos finally broke the silence, his voice a rasp. "Tywin won't waste time. He'll make an example of us. Public executions, hangings, more likely. They'll want to send a message to the rest of the North." Gendry lifted his head, his jaw clenched. "We can't just sit here and wait to die." Ned sighed, his gaze distant. "There's nothing to be done now. The men are broken, scattered. Even if we escaped, where would we go?" Jon's fists tightened. "There's always something to be done." His voice was low, but the defiance in it was unmistakable. Before anyone could respond, the sound of keys jangling echoed down the corridor. Footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate. The door to their cell creaked open, and a Lannister guard stepped inside, flanked by 2 more. "You," the guard pointed at Jon and Ned. "You're wanted." Jon exchanged a glance with his father, who gave a slight nod. Together, they rose to their feet, the cold biting into their bones as they were led out of the cell. Behind them, Davos and Gendry watched in silence, their faces grim. As the door slammed shut behind them, the cell plunged back into darkness, leaving the others to wait, and hope, for whatever fate awaited them. As Jon and Ned trudged through the frozen, blood-soaked courtyard, the weight of defeat pressed heavily on their shoulders. The air reeked of death, metallic, acrid, and clinging to everything. Jon's eyes flicked to the pile of corpses near the wall. Black-cloaked brothers of the Night's Watch, Baratheon soldiers in their crimson hearts, and Lannisters adorned in red and gold were stacked like cordwood, stripped of dignity in death. A chill ran down his spine, and not just from the cold. He knew what was coming if those bodies weren't burned. Turning to the nearest Lannister soldier, Jon's voice cut through the icy air. "If you know what's best for you, you'll burn those, and quickly." The soldier sneered, clearly unimpressed by the warning. His eyes, cold and dismissive, flicked over Jon's battered form. With a rough shove to Jon's back, he barked, "Keep moving, Crow." Jon stumbled but caught himself, casting one last glance at the pile before moving forward. He clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. They don't understand. They were marched into the great hall of Castle Black, though it no longer resembled anything Jon had once known. The walls, usually austere and dark, were now draped with crimson and gold banners. At the far end of the hall, Tywin Lannister sat upon the Lord Commander's chair, Jon's chair, his presence as commanding as ever despite the makeshift surroundings. His left arm was heavily bandaged, blood seeping through the linen, a testament to Gendry's desperate attack. Jon's lips twitched into a grim smile, a fleeting satisfaction that disappeared just as quickly. Tywin's eyes met Jon's, cold and calculating. Beside him sat Jaime, relaxed but alert, ice resting across his lap. He watched the room with a casual confidence, though his eyes occasionally darted to his father's bandaged hand. Jon's gaze moved across the hall, landing on Melisandre. She was barely recognizable. Her once immaculate crimson gown was now torn and stained, her flame-red hair tangled and matted. Her eyes, however, still burned with that unsettling fire. The Lannister guards eyed her with a mixture of fear and lust, their leers blatant, but Jon felt only revulsion. She stood chained, her hands bound in front of her, though her posture remained proud. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile when her eyes met Jon's, as if she still held some secret power. Ned and Jon were forced to their knees in the center of the hall. The cold stone bit into Jon's skin through the thin fabric of his trousers. He kept his head high, refusing to show weakness, though every muscle in his body ached. Tywin leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You've caused me more trouble than you're worth, Stark. Both of you." His gaze flicked between Jon and Ned, measuring them. Jaime smirked. "They've got that northern stubbornness. Runs deep, doesn't it?" Ned's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Jon, however, couldn't keep quiet. "You'll regret not burning the bodies," he said, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his gut. Tywin raised a single, skeptical eyebrow, his sharp gaze narrowing on Jon. The quiet that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of torches lining the hall. Jaime leaned forward, resting his elbows lazily on his knees, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that so, Snow?" Jaime drawled, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. "And why's that?" Jon's eyes, dark and unyielding, locked with Jaime's. His voice was low but resonant, each word biting through the tension like frost-laden steel. "Because winter is coming. And with it, death." A murmur rippled through the room, the assembled soldiers exchanging uneasy glances. Even those who had scoffed at Jon's earlier warnings now seemed unsure. The chill in Jon's voice made the words feel more like a prophecy than a threat. Tywin, however, remained unmoved. He rose from his seat, his stature commanding, his golden lion pin gleaming in the dim light. His mouth curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Oh yes," Tywin said, his tone laced with cold condescension. "We've heard plenty from your brother about this supposed army of death. White walkers, whites, monsters beyond the wall. Fairy tales to frighten children." He took a step forward, his eyes boring into Jon's. "But no matter what stories you spin, the truth remains, your king is dead. Stannis Baratheon is no more. And with him, any hope of victory. So tell me, boy, why continue the charade?" Jon clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he refused to falter. Straightening his back, he met Tywin's gaze head-on. "I am no liar," Jon said, his voice echoing through the cavernous hall. Each word was deliberate, like the measured strikes of a hammer on steel. His eyes swept over the gathered crowd, meeting their sneers and doubts head-on. Despite the weight of the chains on his wrists and the stifling heat from the roaring fires, Jon stood tall. "And Stannis was no king of mine." The hall fell into a tense silence, the air thick with expectation. Jaime Lannister, lounging in his chair like a lion at rest, let his grin widen, intrigued by Jon's defiance. He tilted his head, golden hair catching the light as he studied the young man with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. Tywin, however, was far from amused. His sharp eyes narrowed, and the flicker of a frown deepened the lines on his face. His patience, always thin, was wearing dangerously close to breaking. "And yet you fought beside him," Tywin said coldly. He took a measured step forward, the sound of his boots against the stone floor echoing in the hall. "You housed him and his host in your castle. Forgive me if I don't believe you, boy." Before Jon could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "I knew Stannis from when he was a boy." All eyes turned to Eddard Stark. He stood chained beside his son, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of loss. His gaze was distant, as if he could still see the young man Stannis had once been, before the weight of duty and ambition had crushed him. He was a good man, Ned continued, his voice steady but sorrowful. And I will mourn his death. But he had become something else. A monster, uncontrollable and unyielding. A weapon forged by her. He lifted his chin toward Melisandre, who stood at the far end of the hall, her red dress tattered and stained, her once glorious hair hanging in limp curls around her pale face. Jaime chuckled, leaning forward in his chair. The Lady Melisandre has been incredibly helpful, he said with a smirk. She's told us all about your plans to overthrow Tommen and put Daenerys Targaryen on his throne. His eyes gleamed with mockery. Tell me, Snow. Did Stannis know you were going to betray him before he died? Jon's heart hammered in his chest. The accusation, though not entirely false, stung. That's not true, Jon said, his voice rising with urgency. Ask the Queen, he caught himself. The Lady Sliss. She'll tell you the truth. She'll tell you how this woman, he shot a glare at Melisandre, attached herself to their family like a parasite. How she twisted their minds until they killed their own daughter. An innocent girl. A murmur rippled through the hall, and for a moment, Jon thought he saw doubt flicker in the eyes of some of the soldiers. But then Melisandre stepped forward, her face a mask of calm. The Lady Sliss is dead, she said, her voice smooth and detached. Jon's heart dropped. What? She hung herself, Tywin said, his voice cold and final. We found her in her chambers. She'd been dead for hours. Jon staggered back a step, the weight of the news hitting him like a blow. His mind raced, piecing together the implications. Sliss's death meant there was no one left to speak for him. No one left to confirm his words. She took the coward's way out, Jaime added with a smirk. Probably couldn't bear the guilt of what she did. Jon's fists clenched, his knuckles white. He turned back to Melisandre. You did this. You brought her to this. Melisandre's lips curved into a small, serene smile. I only showed her the path. She chose to walk it. Tywin raised a hand, the simple gesture enough to bring the entire hall to silence. The flames in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on his cold, imperious face. His voice, low and deliberate, cut through the tension like a blade. Enough of this. He stepped forward, his gaze landing squarely on Jon Snow. Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. I, Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King and Lord of Casterly Rock, find you guilty of treason against the one true king, Tommen of House Baratheon. His words were slow, methodical, and merciless. You were sworn to protect the realm, and instead, you conspired to bring about its downfall. For this crime, there is only one punishment, death. Jon's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained stoic. He knew better than to beg or plead. His gaze flickered briefly to his father. You can't. Ned's voice rang out, sharp and desperate. The room's attention shifted to the man who had once been Warden of the North. I did it, Ned continued, his voice cracking but resolute. It was me. I sided with Stannis. Jon didn't know. Robb didn't know. I lied to them all. Tywin's cold eyes regarded him with a flicker of disdain, but not surprise. I'm sure you did, he said. But your bastard led his men against the king's forces. I have no other choice. Ned stepped forward, his chains clinking. Then punish me. Spare him. Tywin's gaze hardened, his lips curling into something between a sneer and a grimace. As noble as ever, Stark. But your time for nobility ended years ago. If I had been in King's Landing when you betrayed King Joffrey, you would have lost your head then. His eyes burned with cold fury. It was a mistake to let you live. A mistake my daughter should have corrected. You are a disease, Ned Stark. One I intend to wipe out. Ned stood taller, his jaw clenched, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, resignation. As for you, Ned Stark, Tywin continued, his voice dripping with finality, you are condemned to death for treason against King Tommen and his predecessor King Joffrey. Take them. Two soldiers seized Jon by the arms, hauling him to his feet. His chains rattled with every step, but he did not resist. The others can watch, Tywine called over his shoulder. Let them see what happens to traitors. As Jon and Ned were dragged toward the doors, the heavy silence in the hall was broken only by the clatter of boots against stone. Jon kept his eyes forward, his heart steady. There was no fear now, only a grim acceptance. His father walked beside him, their fates entwined, their honor intact. The courtyard of Castle Black was blanketed in frost, the snow crunching beneath the boots of Lannister soldiers as they assembled in grim formation. Torches flickered in the frigid wind, their flames casting long, wavering shadows on the blood-stained walls. The banners of House Lannister, red and gold, hung ominously from makeshift posts, a stark reminder of the victors. Jon felt the cold more keenly now. His wrists were raw from the iron shackles, but he didn't care. His eyes were locked on the raised platform at the center of the courtyard, where two wooden blocks waited. Ned walked ahead of him, shoulders straight despite the chains weighing him down. The years had weathered his father's face, but Jon saw the same man who had knelt beside him at Winterfell and told him about honor, about duty. Today, Ned Stark would face death with both intact. Jon watched as the survivors were hauled into the courtyard, shoved roughly into place by Lannister soldiers. They stumbled, weary and broken, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. The Night's Watch brothers, Baratheon loyalists, and a handful of Northerners gathered in a tight, huddled mass. Their breaths came in shallow puffs, visible in the icy air, but no one spoke. Their faces told the story of defeat, ashen and hollow-eyed, etched with disbelief and simmering fury they dared not express. Some clenched their fists, knuckles white, while others stared blankly ahead, as if the weight of what they were about to witness had yet to fully sink in. Gendry, blooded but upright, shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between the guards and the platform where the execution blocks awaited. Davos was among them, his expression grim, lips moving in a silent prayer. Jon's heart tightened as he scanned the group. These were men who had fought beside him, bled beside him. Now, they stood helpless, forced to bear witness to the grim spectacle unfolding before them. Tywine Lannister emerged from the great hall, his cloak sweeping behind him, followed closely by Jaime, whose smug grin seemed permanently etched into his face. The Lannister patriarch climbed a small set of steps to stand on a raised platform, overlooking the proceedings. Lord Eddard Stark, Tywine began, his voice carrying over the courtyard. You have been found guilty of treason against King Tommen Baratheon. For your crimes, you will face the king's justice. Winter is coming for us all, Stark, Lannister. It makes no difference, Ned growled, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. He turned his cold, defiant gaze to Tywine and spat at the ground near his feet. Then, shifting his focus to Gendry, his expression softened. Tell Cat, tell her I love her, he said, voice trembling slightly but steady. And that I'll be waiting. Two soldiers led Ned to the block. He knelt without resistance, bowing his head as if in prayer. The executioner, a hulking man in Lannister colors, stepped forward, raising a massive sword high above his head. Jon's fists clenched, the chains biting into his skin. Every instinct screamed at him to do something, to fight, but he knew it was futile. His father had made peace with his fate. The sword fell, swift and brutal. Ned Stark's head hit the frozen ground, rolling to a stop near the edge of the platform. Gasps and muffled sobs echoed from the crowd, but Jon didn't flinch. He stood motionless, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes burning with a quiet, simmering rage. Tywine's voice broke the silence once more. Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, you have also been found guilty of treason. For your betrayal of the realm, you too will face the king's justice. Jaime chuckled softly from the sidelines. Ready to meet your gods, Snow, he called. Jon ignored him. He stepped forward when the guards prodded him, climbing the platform with steady, deliberate strides. The blood from his father's execution stained the wood beneath his boots. As he knelt before the block, he thought of Ghost, of Winterfell, of Arya's laughter echoing through the halls. He thought of the wall, of Samwell's awkward grin and Winterfell's halls. He thought of the grit and the wild freedom of the north. He did not bow his head. The executioner hesitated for a moment, perhaps unnerved by Jon's steady, defiant gaze. But Tywine's cold nod spurred him into action. The sword rose. Jon closed his eyes. The last thing he heard was the howling wind. Then, darkness. Chapter 60, Rob 17. Chapter text. Rob 18. Rob tipped the decanter again, the dark red wine spilling into the goblet clutched in his hand. He had lost count of how many times he had filled it, but the weight of grief made each sip feel like a necessity. He sat on a cold stone bench in the godswood, the heart tree looming above him, its pale bark almost glowing in the dim light of the setting sun. The letter had come hours ago, carried by a raven with feathers as black as the news it bore. Rob had not spoken a word to anyone after reading it. Instead, he had walked straight here. His plan had been simple, to pour a single drink for his father, and another for John. 2 toasts to honor the dead, to steady himself for what must come next. But grief had other plans. 1 drink became 2, then 3, and soon the decanter sat half empty beside him. He stared into the dark surface of the wine in his cup, as if searching for some reflection of Ned's stern, steady face or John's quiet, determined eyes. All he found was his own haggard reflection, distorted by the rippling liquid. The godswood had always been his place of solace, a sanctuary where he could think without the weight of all his responsibilities pressing down on him. Now it felt cold and unwelcoming, the air heavy with sorrow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world darkened, and the godswood grew colder. Rob barely noticed. The sounds of Winterfell, the clatter of the kitchens, the occasional bark of a dog, felt distant, like they belonged to another life. All that existed for him now was the ache in his chest, the letter crumpled on the bench beside him, and the ever-present sting of failure. He had lost his father. He had lost his brother. And worse, he hadn't been there for either of them. He tipped his head back, draining the goblet, the wine burning in his throat but doing little to dull the ache in his heart. He placed the goblet down beside him, the clang of metal against stone loud in the stillness. Roslyn found him there as the last light faded from the sky, her steps cautious as she entered the godswood. She stopped a few paces away, her breath visible in the cold air. "Rob," she called softly. He didn't turn at first, his shoulders stiffening as if bracing against a blow he couldn't dodge. His breath fogged in the cold air, his head bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, raw from hours of grief. "They're gone, Roslyn. My father. John." Roslyn paused mid-step, her heart sinking at the pain in his voice. She wrapped her arms around herself against the chill as she moved closer. The godswood felt unnaturally still, the rustling leaves above offering no comfort. "Oh, Rob," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. What happened? How?" Rob turned to her at last, his face a mask of anguish and fury. His hand trembled as he unfolded the crumpled letter he'd been clutching. The Lannister lion seal was smeared, his grip having worn away at the wax. He read aloud, his voice cracking with every word. "On this day in the year 306 of our Lord and King Tommen Baratheon, Eddard of the House Stark and Jon Snow were found guilty of treason. Lord Tywin of House Lannister, Hand of the King, spoke with the king's voice and sentenced them to death. Their sentence was carried out immediately, and both men were executed by beheading." Roslyn covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. "Executed," she whispered. "By Tywin?" Rob nodded, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might break. "The bastard didn't even give them a trial. This," he shook the letter violently, "this is all the justice he offers. My father. John, gone, just like that." He threw the letter to the ground, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. Roslyn knelt and picked it up, smoothing the crumpled parchment with shaking hands. She scanned the words, her own breath catching as the weight of the loss settled over her. "Your father. John, they were heroes," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "Tywin Lannister doesn't deserve to speak their names, let alone take their lives." Rob sank back onto the cold stone bench, his hands covering his face. "My father, he was the North. Everything I know about honor, duty, it all came from him," he said, his voice muffled. "And John, he was more than my brother. He was my friend, my partner in everything. And I couldn't save either of them." Roslyn sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You didn't fail them, Rob. You've done everything you could to protect your family, your people. This is Tywin's crime, not yours." Rob's hands dropped from his face, revealing eyes red-rimmed with grief but blazing with determination. But it wasn't enough, he said bitterly. I wasn't there to fight for them, to stop it. Tywin Lannister took everything from me, my father, my brother, and now he thinks he can take the North. Roslyn straightened, her own sorrow giving way to resolve. But he can't, Robb. The North will stand with you, now more than ever. The people loved your father. They will rally behind you because they believe in House Stark, in you. Robb shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. It's not just about the North, Roslyn. It's about justice. Tywin thinks he can butcher my family, but I swear to the gods, I'll see him answer for this. Him, and anyone else who stands with him. Roslyn reached for his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Then we fight, Robb. For your father, for Jon, for the North. You won't face this alone. I'll be by your side, every step of the way. Above them, the heart tree loomed, its carved face weeping blood-red sap as if mourning with them. But the winds that whispered through its branches carried the promise of vengeance. I'll tell Torrhen, Roslyn said softly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. He's young, and he may not fully understand, but he needs to know. In the morning, we'll bring him here together. We'll leave a token, and he can say goodbye to them in his own way. Robb nodded, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. In his grief, he had not considered Torrhen. Selfishly, his thoughts had been consumed by his own loss, by the unbearable absence of his father and brother. His son hadn't known real death before, hadn't yet grasped its permanence. When news of Walder Frey's death had reached them the year prior, Torrhen had been largely unaffected. To him, Walder was little more than a name and a faint memory of a gruff old man. But Ned Stark and Jon Snow were different. Torrhen adored his grandfather, who had doted on him, and he idolized Jon, his stories of adventure and honor lighting up Torrhen's imagination. This would shatter him in ways the boy had never known. You're right, Robb said, his voice thick with emotion. He deserves the truth. They were his family too. Roslyn stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. And I'm sorry, my love, but there's more. You need to tell your mother. Your sisters. They'll want to hear it from you. Robb's jaw tightened, and he looked away, staring at the ground as though it might swallow him whole. I know, he said after a long pause. Gods, how do I even begin? My mother, this will destroy her. She's already lost so much. And Arya. Sansa, he trailed off, his thoughts spinning wildly. I don't know if I have the strength. You do, Roslyn said firmly, taking his hand in hers. You must. For them. For Torrhen. For the North. They need you to be strong, Robb, even if you don't feel it now. And when you're ready, we'll gather the lords and tell them together. Robb exhaled heavily, running a hand through his auburn hair. He looked up at the godswood around them, the blood-red leaves swaying gently in the cold wind. The heart tree loomed above, its ancient face carved into the bark gazing down at him as if bearing witness to his pain. He found no comfort in its stoic expression, only a solemn reminder of the duty that lay ahead. First family, Robb said quietly. After that, the lords. Roslyn squeezed his hand gently, her warmth grounding him for a moment in the chaos. I'll be with you every step of the way, she promised. You're not alone in this, Robb. He looked at her, his grief-stricken eyes softening as he took in her resolve. In this moment, she was his strength, her unwavering love and loyalty a balm to the searing pain in his heart. Thank you, he said, his voice almost a whisper. For everything. Roslyn smiled faintly, her expression tinged with sorrow but filled with determination. We'll get through this, she said. Together. As they stood beneath the heart tree, the cold winds of the north swirling around them, Robb felt the faintest spark of hope. He had lost so much, too much, but he still had his family, his people, and a wife who would stand by him no matter the storm. _____________. The Lord's private office was eerily quiet. Robb Stark stood by the hearth, his back to the room, staring into the flames as if the crackling fire could offer the words he needed to say. His hands rested on the mantle, gripping it tightly, his knuckles pale. The sound of soft footsteps echoed behind him, and he turned to see Arya and Sansa entering the room. Arya moved quickly, her brows furrowed in confusion. Sansa followed more hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her as though bracing for bad news. "You wanted to see us?" Arya asked, her voice sharp, suspicious. Her keen eyes darted around the room, as if she expected a hidden threat to spring forth. Sansa glanced at her brother, her expression more apprehensive. "Robb. What is it?" Robb took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. He gestured toward the empty chairs. "Sit down," he said, his tone somber. Arya's frown deepened. "Just tell us," she said, folding her arms. "What's wrong?" "Arya, please," Robb said, his voice tinged with an uncharacteristic softness. "Sit. This isn't, it's not easy." Something in his tone silenced Arya's protests. She exchanged a glance with Sansa before both girls moved to sit. Sansa's hands tightened around her skirts, her knuckles whitening as she perched on the edge of the seat. Arya leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her restless energy barely contained. Robb crossed the room and stood before them, his shadow looming over their seated forms. He hesitated for a long moment, his throat working as he struggled to find the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with grief. "There's no easy way to say this," he began. "Father and Jon, they're gone." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sansa's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled with tears, the realization dawning slowly and painfully. Arya, on the other hand, stiffened. Her sharp features twisted in disbelief. "What do you mean, gone?" Arya demanded, her voice shaking. "Gone where?" Robb knelt before them, his hands resting on his knees as he looked into Arya's fierce, tear-bright eyes. "They were executed, Arya. Tywin Lannister ordered it. They're dead." "No," Arya whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, that's not true. It can't be true." "Father. Jon," her voice cracked, and she clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. "They wouldn't let that happen. They wouldn't just die." Robb reached for her, but Arya jerked away, springing to her feet. "You're lying," she shouted. "You're lying to us." "Arya," Robb said sharply, standing as well. His tone softened immediately, his grief mirroring hers. "I would never lie to you about this. I swear it on the old gods and the new." Sansa broke then, a strangled sob escaping her lips. She covered her face with her hands, her body trembling as she wept. Robb moved to her side, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. Arya paced, her movements frantic, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'll kill him," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I'll kill Tywin Lannister myself. I'll." "Arya, stop," Robb said, stepping toward her. "I know you're angry. I am too. But we have to think about what comes next. We can't let this consume us." Arya whirled to face him, her eyes blazing with fury. "They were our family," she shouted. "And they're gone because of the Lannisters. You want me to just sit here and do nothing?" Robb's jaw tightened, his blue eyes hardening as a flicker of anger broke through his usually calm demeanor. He took a deep breath, forcing the fury back into the depths of his grief. "No," he said firmly, his voice cutting through Arya's growing storm of emotions. "We'll avenge them. But right now, that's not what they would want." Arya froze mid-step, her fists still clenched at her sides, trembling with barely restrained fury. "Not what they would want," she echoed, her tone incredulous and sharp. "They would want justice. They would want us to fight back. To make Tywin Lannister pay for what he's done." Robb stepped closer to her, his own voice rising, but not with anger, with urgency. "The dead are still coming, Arya. Make no mistake about that. Jon and Father knew it. They gave their lives trying to protect us from that threat, not so we could throw away everything on some ill-planned vengeance." Arya's eyes flared with indignation. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare make this about them. You think Father and Jon would just stand by while the Lannisters get away with this? You think they'd let the real enemy," her voice dripped with sarcasm, "walk all over us without a fight? I think they'd want us to live." Robb shot back, his voice sharp but steady. "To live so we can actually fight the battles that matter. You think storming off to kill Tywin will bring them back? Do you think that's what father wanted for you, for any of us? To die without thought, without strategy, without honor. Arya's face twisted with rage. Don't talk to me about honor, she shouted, her voice cracking. You're sounding just like him now, talking about battles that matter and strategy while our family is dead, and Tywin Lannister is still alive. You want to sit here and plan? Fine. You can plan. I'll do something about it. Robb stepped in her path as she turned to leave, his broad frame blocking her way. Arya, stop, he said, his tone softening but losing none of its firmness. We need you. The North needs you. If we're divided, the Lannisters win without lifting a sword. And if the Lannisters don't finish us, the dead will. Arya glared up at him, her eyes blazing, her jaw set with the fierce stubbornness that reminded Robb so much of their father. Then you fight your war, Robb, she said, her voice sharp as steel. Sit here in your ground keep, surrounded by your lords, and make your plans. I'll fight mine. Her words hit him harder than any blow. Robb's shoulders sagged under the weight of her defiance, his anger and grief simmering beneath the surface. Arya, he started, his voice soft, almost pleading. No, she cut him off, her tone final. You're just like Sansa. Always waiting. Waiting for someone else to make the first move. Waiting for the perfect moment that never comes. Well, I won't. She turned sharply. Robb stepped forward instinctively, reaching out to stop her, but she was already at the door. The slam echoed through the room as she stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Robb made to follow her, his frustration mounting, but a hand on his arm stopped him. He turned to see Sansa, her face pale but determined. Don't, she said softly. You'll only make it worse. Sansa, he began, but she shook her head, cutting him off. She's not ready to listen to you, not right now. Let me talk to Alicent. She needs someone who can get through to her, and right now, that isn't us. Robb hesitated, his hand hovering at his side as though he could still catch Arya before she disappeared completely. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and nodded, stepping back. Maybe you're right, he admitted reluctantly. I don't want her to do something reckless. She's Arya, Sansa said, her voice carrying a faint, bittersweet smile. When has she ever not been reckless? Robb tried to smile, but the weight of the moment was too heavy. He slumped into his seat, rubbing a hand over his face. His grief and frustration swirled together, leaving him feeling helpless in the face of so much loss. Will you join me? He asked after a moment, his voice low. When I tell Mother. Sansa hesitated, her face clouding with uncertainty. I can't, she said finally, regret lacing her words. I need to speak with Tyrion, decide what we do next. Robb frowned, confused. What do you mean? Sansa's gaze dropped briefly, as if searching for the right words, before meeting his eyes. You may have forgotten, brother, but my husband and my son are Lannisters. And now Lannisters have started killing Starks. Your lords may not be so welcoming once they learn that detail. Robb's frown deepened, but before he could respond, Sansa stepped closer and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. This is something you need to do alone, she said quietly. Robb stared after her as she left, her words lingering in his mind. He slumped back into his chair, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He didn't relish the thought of facing his mother with this news, another blow to her already battered heart. But Sansa was right. It had to be done. Underscore. Robb's heart pounded in his chest as he stood outside his parents' chambers. His parents had given up the Lord's chambers years ago, when Robb had taken up the mantle of lordship, but even now, Robb occasionally felt like an intruder as he slept in what had once been his parents' bed. He raised his hand to knock, and before long his mother's voice called from inside, soft but clear. Come in. Robb pushed the door open, stepping into the familiar room, but today it felt different, heavier. His mother was at the small table by the window, carefully lighting 2 candles, her movements slow and deliberate. It was a nightly tradition she had kept for years, 1 candle for Bran, 1 for Rickon. The flickering flames danced softly in the dim room, casting a warm, golden glow over her tired face. She had always believed that the light of the candles would guide her sons home, wherever they were. His throat tightened, and he felt the weight of the news he was about to deliver. How could he tell her? How could he tell her that Ned, the man who had always been her protector, her strength, had died? "Mother," Rob's voice faltered as he approached her, his heart heavy with the burden of the truth. She turned toward him, her hands still holding the lit candles. She looked at him with a soft, knowing smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes.